Chapter 29. A round shot struck the very centre of McCulloch's company, decapitating one fusilier and taking the arm from another. Jack tore his gaze from the awful sight and tried to stand as still as possible. Despite his best efforts, he could not help flinching at every deadly projectile that rushed by. One came so close to his head that he felt the powerful rush of air as it flew past. His terror was like a caged beast that prowled and fought for escape from deep inside him. Time crawled by, every second seeming like a minute, every minute like an hour. The barrage tossed and churned the ground around the company, the dark soil like spilt blood across the bright green grass. It was enough to drive a man to madness. Yet the redcoats endured the trial. They lay in their ranks and held their terror at bay, waiting for the order to move. To Jack's horror, a round shot struck one of his men. In front of his sickened eyes, it smashed down straight into Fusilier Trotter, ripping his arm from his body and sending a fountain of bright red blood into the air. Trotter screamed a single shrill cry that rang loudly in the ears of his fellow redcoats before he fell mercifully silent. "On your feet!" Jack echoed the order he heard shouted somewhere to his right. "Lively now!" The Fusiliers pulled themselves to their feet, relieved to be moving, yet terrified to be advancing. "Fix bayonets!" This was it, the final preparation before the men closed with the enemy. The Fusiliers pulled their long bayonets from their belts, locking them into place on their already loaded rifles. The officers drew their swords and pulled revolvers from their pouches. The bugle sounded the advance, and the long red line jerked into motion, leaving their dead behind them. The Fusiliers marched towards the river, where the 95th were already engaging the enemy. The far riverbank was crowded with Russian skirmishers, who sniped at the advancing red line. Puffs of smoke erupted from the barrels of the Greenjackets' rifles as the British skirmishers returned fire. They moved in extended order, fighting in pairs, like grasshoppers performing an intricate dance. One man from each pair dropped to one knee to fire at the Russian sharpshooters, while the other moved forward, covering his partner until he was loaded and ready to move. Officers and sergeants choreographed the movement with shouts and whistles, ensuring their men fought with ruthless efficiency. Jack watched the Greenjackets at work, impressed by their skill. The line of redcoats marched steadily forwards, forcing the riflemen to move quickly to screen the progress of the battalions. Jack was convinced his company would have performed as well, his Fusiliers at least the equal of the grasshoppers. The thought that, had he had his way, he would already be in action, sent an icy wave of fear flushing through his veins. He had never expected to be so terrified. He led his men forward into the shattered remains of a vineyard. Long lines of vines lay twisted underfoot, decades of careful tending and growth trampled under the careless boots of the advancing redcoats. A handful of vines survived, and the Fusiliers snatched a bunch of ripe grapes as they passed by, gorging on the juicy fruit even as they marched into the storm of fire. A Fusilier from the left flank of McCulloch's company fell to the Russian fire, his face a mask of blood that spilled over the grapes still in his mouth. He toppled silently to the ground, his death ignored by the men either side of him. The closest sergeant ordered the ranks to close up. There was no time for compassion, sympathy, or grief. The advance could not falter. Rifle bullets fluttered through the vineyard, flicking the branches and buzzing past the ears of the Fusiliers, as if the crop was under attack from a plague of deadly insects. The Russian fire was heavy. It was worse, far worse than Jack could ever have imagined. It seemed inevitable that all the redcoats must surely be struck down. Yet, by some miracle, only a man here and there fell to the enemy fire. The redcoats continued to advance. Then Jack was shot. A solid object thumped hard against his body, a stab of pain flaring in the very centre of his chest. His free hand clutched at the pain, his shaking fingers feeling for the tattered flesh that would reveal a horrific wound. His fingers closed over a solid lump that rested against his ribs. With a shaking hand, Jack pulled the musket ball from where it had lodged in his jacket. Fired at long range, the bullet had not had the force to pierce his flesh, its power already spent. Apart from a neat hole in his coat, it had done no damage. Shaking with a heady mix of fear and relief, Jack hurled the musket ball away. If the Russians had been armed with Minié rifles, Jack knew he would now be dead. It was a sobering thought, and he silently offered his grateful thanks to a beneficent God that had denied the majority of the Russian army modern weaponry. The Russian infantry on the slopes to the south of the Alma were wasting their powder. Their ancient muskets lacked the power to inflict much damage at such a distance. Fusiliers gasped and swore as the spent bullet struck them. The stinging blow was painful, but it did little except shred the men's uniforms and their already strained nerves. But the Russian skirmishers were aimed with modern rifles. They were starting to exact a high toll on the line that snaked towards the Alma. Sergeant Shepherd fell. His shoulder smashed, and 2 more Fusiliers from the light company went down under the withering fire. The British wounded were abandoned to their fate. Some picked themselves up, bravely rushing forward to catch up with their company, cursing at the pain, staunching their wounds as best they could. Others walked, crawled, or pulled themselves to the rear, desperate to get out of the line of fire. The continual order to close the ranks was all that marked the passing of the fallen. "Come on!" Jack roared, urging his men forward. He sensed the pace of the advance begin to falter. The men were still moving forward, but the steady, rhythmic pace of the march was gone. The long, red chain was breaking up. The men were moving towards the river in small groups or on their own, their instinct to find cover becoming ever more powerful as more of their mates fell to the enemy fire. "Leave him!" 2 Fusiliers had paused to help one of their mates who had taken the bullet in the thigh, the blood pulsing over the fingers he clasped desperately to the gaping hole in his leg. "Come on! Move! Move, you sluggards! Get moving!" Digby Brown, too, was driving the men forward, physically pushing any Fusilier who hesitated. The young lieutenant mimicked his captain, grabbing any who stopped to help a wounded man and sought to use the charitable act as an excuse to stop advancing into the merciless fire. Step by faltering step, the redcoats edged to the far side of the vineyard. The bank of the Alma River was now just a few short yards ahead. At the edge of the vineyard, the Fusiliers staggered to a halt. They stared in fear at the open bank that led down the gentle slope to the riverbank. The dozen yards taunted them, daring them to leave the meagre sanctuary of the shattered vineyard. The enemy fire seemed to redouble as they stood there, refusing to advance despite the roars of the officers. Jack screamed at his men to advance, thumping his fists against the backs of the terrified Fusiliers. He could see the fear in their faces and the flashes of anger as he tried to drive them into the horrific fire that fenced the open ground in front of them. "Fusiliers!" Jack's voice was huge. "Advance, damn you! Move! Move!" But the fear of the enemy fire was too strong. The British advance had stopped. Chapter 30. Colonel Morris looked on in horror as his battalion went to ground. He was at the centre of the Fusiliers' ranks, not that the line truly existed anymore. Behind him, the young faces of the ensigns carrying the colours were ashen white, terror bright in their eyes. Bodies lay on the ground, the twisted corpses of men who had been under his command abandoned amidst the ruin of the vineyard. He saw the tremor in the Fusiliers' ranks as they began to shuffle backwards. Morris refused to let his battalion retreat. Even if it led to their destruction, the Fusiliers would advance. "King's Royal Fusiliers will advance!" he screamed, demanding his men respond. They ignored him. "King's Royal Fusiliers!" Morris stood tall in his stirrups. Fear twisted inside him as he made himself an obvious target. "Advance!" Colonel Morris stared at his men, unable to believe that they were stubbornly refusing to obey. The shame of retreat was more than he could stand. He felt tears of impotence prick at his eyelids. Then, a single officer broke from the tattered ranks. Captain Slomes, the commander of the light company, burst from the midst of his fusiliers. His mouth was wide open, bellowing for his men to follow, but Morris was too far away to hear the words. He watched, mesmerised, as Slomes turned on the open ground to face the cowering redcoats and berate them. Morris could see the fear on the officer's face, saw him flinch as bullets whipped past. Then he raced across the open ground and into the river, and the Fusiliers followed. They stormed from the pathetic remains of the vineyard, charging like a huge red herd. Morris felt a surge of pride as he watched his men follow the example set by the insane bravery of one officer. Dozens were struck, their bodies thrown violently to the ground. The enemy fire simply could not miss, but the redcoats ignored the casualties and kept going. Morris urged his horse forward to join the pack of redcoats, churning the riverbank into a muddy slick. He tried to shout across to Captain Slomes, but his words were lost in the noise of the melee. He wanted to convey his thanks, but his view of the light company's commander was blocked by another mounted figure who was pushing his way through the muddled ranks of redcoats to reach the shelf screening the men from the worst of the enemy fire. "Good show, Morris! Let's get on with it, shall we?" General Codrington spurred past him. Quite what his brigade commander hoped to achieve in the midst of the broken ranks was beyond Morris's comprehension, but he urged his own horse forward and followed his general. The redcoats greeted the appearance of their brigade commander with a huge cheer. Codrington let his willing horse pick its way up the far bank before he turned in the saddle, sweeping his old-fashioned bicorn hat from his head in a grand, theatrical gesture. "Come on, Fusiliers, advance!" The redcoats bellowed their approval. They stormed out of the shelter of the Alma, scrambling up the greasy riverbank so they could begin the advance up the pristine slope that led to the great redoubt. To the right of Morris's battalion, the 7th Fusiliers scrambled out of the river, led by Colonel Lacey Yeh. "Never mind, forming up," he yelled, waving his sword. "Come on, men! Come on!" His Fusiliers responded. The battalions of Codrington's brigade left the river and followed their officers up the slope towards the heart of the Russian position. Jack elbowed his way towards the front of his company, ignoring the loud protests of the men he shoved out of the way. His feet squelched in his boots, his lower body was wet and chilled, but the petty discomfort was easily ignored. Nothing was of any consequence aside from his determination to lead his company from the front. He was close to breaking free from the crowd of Fusiliers when the redcoat directly in front of him was hit. The power of the bullet's impact knocked the Fusilier backwards, his hands clutching at the ruin of his face. Jack recoiled as the soldier reeled back against him, the redcoat's body twisted in agony, his scream of anguish cut off with a sickening gurgle as a wash of blood filled his throat. In his horror, Jack shoved the wounded man cruelly to one side, and he fell to the ground. The advance pressed on. The unfeeling boots of the wounded man's fellow redcoats thumped into his body, their oaths and curses at the obstacle, the last sounds the dying redcoat would ever hear. The air was alive with rifle bullets. At the head of his company, Jack flinched uncontrollably as the shot flickered past him, his ears full of the cries of pain that followed the sickening sound of the bullets hitting live flesh. He kept his eyes fixed on the wooden walls of the great redoubt, trying to shut out the horror that was all around him, his body quivering with barely controlled terror. In front of his battalion, Jack could see Colonel Morris urging his powerful horse up the slope. Morris was close to 50 yards ahead of the Fusiliers when he suddenly rose up in his stirrups. At first, Jack thought the colonel was standing tall in the saddle to cheer his men on. To his horror, Morris kept moving, arching backwards before tumbling out of the saddle. When Jack reached him, the colonel was lying stretched out on the ground, his body twisted like a rag doll. In front of Jack's horrified gaze, Morris's body twitched where it lay, jerking like a landed fish as more Russian bullets slammed mercilessly into his prostrate body. Jack did not need to look at the blood pooling around the body. to know the colonel was dead. Far up the slope, the Russian skirmishers fired for a final time before they withdrew, disappearing out of sight over the crest of the slope. The air was suddenly still, and Jack tore his gaze from his colonel's lifeless body to stare in bewilderment at the Russian soldiers' sudden withdrawal. The ridge was clear of enemy soldiers, the path to the great redoubt inviting and open. The fusilier behind Jack pushed him hard in his back, impatient at his dawdling, unceremoniously thumping his officer forward. The jarring blow to his back sent a spasm of pain surging up his spine, but it brought him to his senses. The time to mourn Colonel Morris's passing would come later. Right now, those officers left standing had to lead the men forward to inspire them to victory. Chapter 31. The pace of the advance quickened now that the withering fire of the Russian skirmishers had ended. No other enemy soldiers appeared to contest the redcoats' passage. The fusiliers surged up the slope, all order forgotten. In some places the line had broken completely, and one or two men were advancing on their own. Every step took them closer to the enemy artillery, which stayed ominously silent, hidden behind the high face of the redoubt. The open slope invited the advance, as welcoming as the splayed legs of a whore. General Codrington curbed his skittish young horse, slowing its pace as he scanned the open ground. Codrington fretted. He simply could not credit that the Russian general had left his flank wide open. The entrenched battery of artillery was a menacing threat, yet no cannon, however well positioned, could hope to resist a determined attack alone. Codrington knew there had to be more enemy infantry close by, but frustratingly, he could not see where they waited, and what he could not see he could not fight. He did not doubt that the brigade had to press home the attack. They must be bold and trust to quick, direct action, but the disordered redcoats were vulnerable. On the left of Codrington's men, the Light Division's 2nd Brigade, commanded by General Buller, were forming up. Two of its 3 battalions, the 77th and 88th, had moved to the side to form into square, something an infantry battalion usually only did if threatened by enemy cavalry. The 3rd, the 19th, had joined Codrington's brigade, further evidence that the Light Division's ordered plan of attack was in total disarray. Codrington knew he had every reason to order the advance to halt and give his officers the time they needed to reform the ranks. It was the sensible course of action, the pragmatic thing to do. But any delay gave the Russian general more time to move up fresh troops, to reinforce the great redoubt and secure the exposed flank. Delay, and the opening would be slammed shut. Codrington dug his spurs into the flank of his mount, urging the young horse up the slope. He damned caution and threw prudence to the wind. The Fusilier Brigade would attack as it was. Ahead of the Fusiliers, the green jackets of the 95th still screened their progress, the loose chain of skirmishers leading the way up the slope. Then, without warning, they stopped. They dropped to one knee and hurriedly opened fire. Jack tried to see what they were firing at, but it was impossible to see past the green jackets. Jack heard the threat before he saw it. It sounded like a distant freight train thundering up the line. But this was no machine. It was the rhythmic drumming of hundreds of boots hitting the ground in unison. Through a gap in the skirmish line, Jack finally caught sight of the source of the pounding. A column of hundreds of Russian infantrymen, 2 battalions of the Kazansky regiment, was aimed like an immense fist at the redcoats. There was no subtlety in the attack, no deft manoeuvre. This was war by numbers, the column an overwhelming force sent to smother the attackers. The 95th Rifles fired and fired again at the huge column. Each shot claimed a victim, but they could no more stop the Russian advance than a child could stop the rising tide by flinging pebbles into the sea. The officers of the 95th bowed to the inevitable and blew their whistles, ordering the skirmishers to move to the flanks of the British battalions. They had done all they could. The Russian column flowed down the slope to the east of the Great Redoubt, aiming at the left flank of the Fusiliers' brigade advance. 2 battalions stood in its path. One, the 19th Regiment of Foot, should not have been there. It was part of General Buller's command and should have been with the other 2 battalions that made up the 2nd Brigade and were currently formed in a square to the right of Codrington's men. Alongside the 19th stood the 23rd Royal Welsh Fusiliers. Both battalions were badly disordered, their companies hopelessly intertwined and with their sergeants and officers far from their allotted positions. Even the most inexperienced ensign saw the danger the unformed ranks faced. Yet there was no panic. In calm, measured tones, the officers brought the disordered advance to a halt and started to reform the ranks, organising the men who were closest to them, irrespective of their proper station. A line, 2 men deep, emerged. It was uneven, bulging, and then thinning out, but it was the best the officers could do in the time available. The line was longer than the width of the advancing column, and so the officers on the flanks ordered their men a few paces forward, until the British line resembled a flat U. With both ends of the line inclining forward, every rifle could be brought to bear on the Russian column. In the packed ranks of the Russian column, only the men at the very front could fire, its own clumsy bulk obstructing the majority from bringing their weapons to bear. The drums in the centre drove it onwards, hundreds of conscripts carried along by the mesmeric beat of the drums and the glory of the moment. "Present!" 2 British battalions raised the muzzles of their rifles. The redcoats were not overawed by the huge column bearing down upon them. They had been brought up on stories of the Peninsula and of the famous victory at Waterloo, tales that told them of the thin British lines that had stood with dogged determination in the face of Napoleon's veterans, beating back the best troops that the Emperor could throw against them. "At 100 yards! Volley, fire!" The redcoats aimed down their sights at the massed Russian ranks, bracing themselves for the powerful kick of their Minié rifles. "Fire!" The 2 battalions fired within moments of each other. Each volley wrought a dreadful destruction. It was as if the head of the column had marched into the maws of a mincing machine. The high-powered Minié bullets gutted men in the 4th, 5th, and even the 6th rank. The Russian conscripts were literally torn to pieces, their limbs smashed, huge holes ripped in their flesh. "For God's sake, where is Major Peacock?" Jack screamed in frustration. The noise of the battlefield was immense, overwhelming his brain with its dreadful cacophony. His cry was lost in the volleys of rifle fire that the 19th and the 23rd were pouring into the Russian column to his left. Smoke drifted across the ground, screening events that were unfolding a matter of yards away from where he stood. The light company had lost contact with the 23rd during their pell-mell advance up the slope. Away on his right, the 7th, under Colonel Lacey, was surging in a disordered scramble up the slope. Jack heard the Russians to his left return fire, but he could not even see the enemy. He looked around for orders. With Colonel Morris lying dead on the slopes behind the battalion, command had fallen to Major Peacock. Yet there was no sign of him. He should have been on foot with the colour party in the centre of the battalion. With Peacock nowhere in sight, the battalion was leaderless. "Sir! Sir!" Digby Brown forced his way through the ranks, flushed with sweat. "We must advance." "I know! Jesus Christ!" A glance along the stalled line showed that he was not alone in looking around for command. The captains of the other companies had pushed their way to the front of the line, their heads turning this way and that as they tried to find out who was commanding the battalion. "Where the hell is Peacock?" Digby Brown had to shout to be heard over the sound of the Russian column returning fire. "Blow me if I know. Jesus Christ, what a fuck-up!" "Reload!" As the redcoats brought their rifles down from their shoulders, the Russian column shuddered to a halt. Stunned conscripts who had thought themselves safe deep in the column now found themselves at the front of the attack. The slaughtered front ranks formed a grotesque obstacle, blocking the way forward. Their officers' commands to advance were ignored. Not one Russian conscript was willing to clamber over the bodies of their comrades and move closer to the red line that had delivered such an appalling storm of violence. They raised their muskets and returned the British fire from where they stood. The smoke, billowing around the redcoats' line, twitched and flickered as the Russian musket balls penetrated the cloud, but the volley did little damage. It picked at the redcoats, taking a man here and there, but it was nothing compared to the carnage inflicted by the Minié rifles. The British sergeants closed the ranks where the dead and the dying left gaps in the line, the redcoats shuffling together even as they reloaded their rifles. The second volley tore into the stalled Russian column. Their torn ranks valiantly returned fire, picking off more redcoats. Despite the terrible destruction wrought upon them, the Russians still vastly outnumbered their attackers. They could absorb the terrible casualties and still have enough men to win through, if they could summon the courage to advance. The redcoats ignored their casualties, always shuffling together, closing the ranks and presenting an unbroken front to the enemy. The British line fired for a third time. The dead and the dying covered the ground where the front dozen ranks of Russians had stood. It was a charnel house. The Russian conscripts started to inch backwards. No soldiers in the world could stand against such dreadful destruction. Their ranks were gutted, and hundreds of their fellows lay bleeding and torn in front of them. The Russians broke. History had been repeated. The line had turned the column. While the 19th and the 23rd were engaging the 1st and 2nd battalions of the Kazansky Regiment, a second Russian column moved obliquely across the undulating slope of the valley. It was made up of the 3rd and 4th battalions of the Kazansky Regiment, and it was aimed at the exposed right flank of the attacking redcoats. It marched unnoticed. The noise of its advance was lost in the dreadful din of the volleys that were being poured into the first column, and its packed ranks were hidden by the natural folds in the land. A cloud of skirmishers surrounded the head of the column as thickly as flies on a dung heap. They broadened the point of its attack and greatly increased its firepower. At its heart, the drummers beat out the staccato rhythm of the march. The ceaseless tempo drove it forward, every step taking it closer towards the flank of the unsuspecting enemy troops. The 7th Fusiliers stood on the right flank of Codrington's brigade, the last battalion in the line. Colonel Lacey had spurred up the slope far ahead of his men, only slowing his charger as he came up against the rear of the Greenjackets, whose skirmish line was strung across the slope in front of his battalion. Impatiently, Lacey twisted in his saddle, his quick temper rising at the slow progress of his men. He had followed Codrington's lead, rushing his men forward, trading the battalion's cohesion for speed. The sight of his men advancing in what could only be described as a mob raised a grimace of distaste on his proud features. This was certainly not the glorious assault he had envisaged, the likes of which were depicted in so many of the pictures on the walls of his family's estate. "Damn you, sluggards! Advance the 7th! Press on, men! Press on!" Lacey had to pull hard to turn the head of his horse round. Despite his impatience, he had let his men catch up. Colonels were not supposed to charge alone. As he sought to curb his skittish young horse, he thought he saw movement on the right flank of the brigade's advance. With both hands on the reins, he peered through the smoke, his eyes straining. The cloud of powder smoke cleared, and the head of the 2nd Russian column loomed into view. Lacey stared in astonishment as the column marched across the slope towards the right flank of his disordered battalion. He was staring at defeat, at the near-certain destruction of his battalion. The colonel dug in his spurs and raced back down the slope towards his command. "7th Fusiliers! Form line! Form line!" There was no time for anything but a desperate defence. His only option was to throw his battalion across the front of the Russian advance and risk everything on his men's willingness to stand toe-to-toe with the enemy horde. Of the 4 battalions that had followed Codrington in his advance towards the Great Redoubt, the 3rd was about to become heavily engaged with the enemy. That left just one to carry on the assault. The King's Royal Fusiliers would have to capture the great redoubt on their own. Chapter 32. "Fusiliers! Fusiliers!" General Codrington galloped across the slope, his grey Arab pony lathered in sweat. The brigade commander had seen the advance grind to a halt as 3 battalions traded volleys with 2 massive Russian columns. Only the King's Royal Fusiliers were unengaged, but that battalion had stopped advancing and now stood impotently halfway up the slope towards the great redoubt. Codrington would not let his attack falter. Standing tall in his stirrups, he waved his old-fashioned bicorn hat, bellowing for the Fusiliers' attention. "Fusiliers! King's Royal Fusiliers! Advance! Advance!" Lieutenant Flowers was the first to respond. "Come on! Follow the General!" he yelled, and spurred his tired horse up the slope. "Advance!" Codrington rammed the decrepit bicorn back on his head. With his right hand now free, he drew his sword, all the while shouting his encouragement over the din of battle. The Fusiliers responded, and once again surged up the slope, led by their general and their adjutant. They cheered as they advanced. It was a ragged cry, barely more than a growl, but it released some of their fear. Ahead, the great redoubt was ominously silent. The redcoats could see the muzzles of the Russian cannon pointing down the slope. They braced themselves for the 12 Russian guns to fire, a terrible fear building as they got closer to the redoubt. The tension was dreadful. 12 pieces of artillery would deliver a storm of canister and round shot that would shred the advancing line, snatching dozens of the Fusiliers into oblivion and leaving countless more twitching and bleeding in its wake. Yet still the redcoats marched forward, their desperate courage and sheer bloody mindedness pushing them onwards. They marched as if into the face of a violent storm, leaning forward as if battered by a fierce wind, their muscles straining. Their chests heaved with the exertion of the advance, and the pitiless heat of the sun baked them in their thick red jackets. With 400 yards to go, a young drummer boy in the centre of the battalion stumbled and fell, his body tumbling over the large drum tethered to his front. The terrified youngster remained on the ground, curling round the broken instrument, hugging it close as he lay weeping and trembling with overwhelming fear. At 350 yards, a Fusilier in McCulloch's company let his rifle slip from his sweating hand. The redcoat marched on regardless, leaving his weapon, terror driving him forward, all rational thought forced from his brain. The discarded rifle lay abandoned, trampled and broken under the heedless boots of the Fusiliers that marched behind. With 300 yards to go, the Russian battery fired. The power of the volley was terrible. The solid round shot cut through the British ranks, each missile killing several men, the red-hot iron balls passing through successive bodies. Large gaps were blown in the ranks. The screaming began. Despite their horrendous casualties, the British line continued forward, heedless of those left behind, stepping over the dead and the dying, callously ignoring the shrieks of agony and the pleas for aid. The first Russian volley released the tension. The redcoats' terror was still bright, but now the agony of anticipation was over. There was nothing left but to close with the enemy and exact a bitter revenge on the merciless Russian gunners. The Russian gunners swabbed out the red-hot barrels of their guns, producing hissing clouds of steam. Then they frantically rammed and reloaded them. They knew that their survival depended on tearing the attacking line to shreds, on slaughtering enough of the British so that the survivors broke and ran, rather than face certain death from the guns. If the redcoats got into the battery, their revenge would be terrible. The dreadful steel bayonets that glinted so brightly in the sunshine would hack and gouge at the men who had laid down the barrage of fire with such ruthless precision. The Russian gunners switched to loading canister, a tin can packed full of musket balls that would explode as it emerged from the muzzle of the cannon. It was a brutal weapon, a close-range killing machine. The Russian guns fired again. Jack whimpered in terror as the blast of canister tore through the light company. Sergeant Adams took a load full in the face. His head exploded before Jack's horrified eyes, splattering the men around him with blood, brains, and scraps of flesh. His body lurched forward like a grotesque, headless puppet for another pace before it fell to the ground, blood pouring from the tattered stump of his neck. More Fusiliers had fallen to the devastating fire. English Davis lay twisted on the ground behind the advancing line, his stomach ripped open, his guts spilling out of the terrible wound to pulse, bloody and blue in the bright sunshine. At his side, another Fusilier screamed abuse at the Russian gunners, whose shot had smashed his legs into a vile pulp. Some Fusiliers took their wounds in silence, pressing on even as their blood dripped from their bodies. Lieutenant Thomas wept as he marched, his left arm hanging loosely against his side, the limb shattered and bleeding profusely from a deep wound above the elbow. The subaltern's tears carved thin channels through his dirt-encrusted face before the young officer smeared them away with his sleeve, more concerned that the men should not see him cry than he was about the severity of the wound. Fusilier O'Callaghan, one of the company's new recruits, calmly bent to the ground and retrieved his severed arm, ignoring the blood that spurted from the tattered remnant of flesh that had once been his elbow. He turned serenely to begin the long march to the rear, the detached limb cradled carefully in the crook of his surviving arm. Another volley blasted down the slope. Soldiers littered the ground, corpses tripping the living. Wounded redcoats plucked at the coats of those still standing, begging for aid, for water, or for a bullet to end their agony. Jack turned away from the horror being wrought on his men, his stomach churning in revulsion. His company was being destroyed before his eyes, and he was powerless to stop it. He meant nothing against such destruction, all his ambition and all his hopes washed away in the sea of blood. The Fusiliers had no choice but to advance. If they stopped, then they would be slaughtered where they stood. Instinctively they bunched together, unwittingly making the gunners' work easier. Jack forced himself forward. He wanted to lead from the centre of the battalion line. He knew it was a pathetic gesture, but it was one he was determined to make. As he moved, he cast a glance along the ranks, ever hopeful that Slater would have been struck down by the terrible storm. Slater noticed Jack's look, and he met his eyes with a cold, flat stare. He was covered in blood, but it was not his own. The gore belonged to a nearby Fusilier who had been torn apart by a burst of canister. Slater spat in derision, and Jack looked away, trying to suppress the dread that flared in his soul. Chapter 33. Step by bloody step, the Fusiliers forced themselves up the slope. Lieutenant Flowers led them forward, his resilient horse overtaking Codrington's tiring young Arab. The young adjutant was determined to be first into the redoubt, to follow his colonel's example by leading the battalion from the front. As the distance closed, he gathered his reins in one hand and with the other gripped and re-gripped the handle of his sword. Horse and rider tensed as they readied to take a wild leap over the wall of the redoubt, as if it was a hedge in a fox hunt. Behind him, the Fusiliers picked up the pace, desperate to cover the last few yards before the Russian gunners could fire again. The front hooves of Flowers' horse had already left the ground to leap over the wall when the Russian battery fired again. The adjutant was so close to the muzzle of a Russian cannon that he and his horse were touched by the blast of flame that leapt out of its mouth. A heartbeat later, and both ceased to exist. A single blast of canister striking them in midair, instantly reducing man and beast to nothing more than a gory tangle of blood and offal. The British line staggered under the volley. At such close range, each load of canister cut a fan-shaped wedge of death through the already badly mauled redcoats. Jack screamed as the guns fired, a shriek of complete terror that was lost in the massive explosion. Instinctively he crossed his arms to protect his face from the blast. The smoke from the volley choked him, the stink of rotten eggs filled his nostrils. The canister obliterated the leading ranks, but somehow he remained whole. He made for the wall of the redoubt. He saw General Codrington leap the 4-foot-high wall seconds before he reached it himself. He planted one foot in the gap between the two tree trunks that had been laid horizontally to form the base of the wall, and propelled himself up and over it. Sharp splinters tore at his hand, the sudden pain nearly causing him to drop the sword that he held tightly in his right hand. His men piled over after him. As their boots thumped down hard on the Russian side of the redoubt, Jack expected a volley of musketry or thrusting bayonets to greet them, but no enemy infantry contested their arrival. They had abandoned the Russian gunners, and the gunners themselves were trying to escape. After the final volley, they had dragged their guns backwards and were now frantically trying to limber the weapons up to the waiting teams of horses. Not far from where Jack stood, a Russian officer was using his riding whip to exhort his men to hurry up and finish attaching one cannon to the limber and team of horses that would drag it to safety. Jack saw the colour drain from the Russian's face as he caught sight of the redcoats vaulting over the wall of the redoubt. The officer dropped his whip and drew a thin, curved sabre. He swung it hard against the back of one of his men, cursing his slowness. Fusilier Dodds landed next to Jack, and the redcoat screamed his disgust at the Russian gunner's attempt to escape. "Stole away?" "Dodds, follow me." Jack would not let the enemy slip away without a fight. He had watched his men massacred at the hands of these Russian gunners. It was time to exact a revenge for their suffering. With Dodds screaming incoherently at his side, Jack charged at the Russian gunners. His anger was terrible, a remorseless rage that corrupted his soul. Nothing mattered except for the burning need to bury his blade in the flesh of the Russian gunners. His fear had been banished, the fury that replaced it all-consuming and terrible. The Russian gunners saw them coming. In a final desperate bid to escape, the horse team whipped their mounts into motion. The gun train lurched forward, its trail gouging a deep channel in the ground. The gun twisted, and for a moment it looked as if it would overturn. Then with a jolt it straightened, and the horses surged away from the redcoats. But in their haste, the gunners had left two of the traces unbuckled. With a loud snap of breaking lines, the terrified horses tore free of the cannon. They raced away, their sides whipped by their riders who left the cannon and their comrades behind. Jack focused his attention on the slim Russian officer who had been beating his men. Jack was close enough to see every detail of the Russian's face, from his gaunt, beardless cheeks to the thin moustache on his upper lip. His pinched lips stood out, cherry red against his white face. The young officer put his right foot forward, smoothly taking the position of a trained swordsman, his thin sabre pointing at Jack, his left hand angled backwards, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. The idea of fencing with the Russian officer never entered Jack's mind. He ran at the Russian with wild abandon, a banshee cry of fear and anger bursting from his mouth. He swept his sword forward, slamming the sabre to one side, and crashed into the Russian with a teeth-juddering impact, knocking him onto his back. Jack landed on top of him with such force that he felt ribs breaking in the Russian's chest. Jack pulled his arm back and punched the iron hilt of his sword into the man's unprotected face, once, twice, then a third time, beating the Russian to death. Armed with swords, handspikes and rammers, the Russian gunners charged the Fusiliers with hopeless bravery. One gunner made straight for Jack, his mouth pulled back in a snarl of fury. Jack flung his sword up, his knees still pressing down on the corpse of the Russian officer, and deflected the gunner's handspike. But the wild parry threw him off balance, and he fell off the body onto the ground. The gunner recovered quickly and twisted round, aiming his makeshift weapon straight at Jack's exposed chest. The flash of a rifle seared over Jack. The bullet drove the gunner backwards, leaving a large hole in his dark blue jacket. The Minier ball had struck him in the left-hand side of the chest, killing him instantly. "Got the fucker!" Fusilier Dodds hauled his officer to his feet, a ferocious grin on his filthy face. "Come on, sir. No time for a lie-down yet." Jack grunted his thanks and braced himself for the next attack. It came from a huge Russian gunner who swung a wooden swab at his head. Drops of water flew from the damp fleece that still covered the last foot of its length. Jack ducked, almost thrusting his face onto the short sword of a second gunner who attacked from the right. The blade flashed by a mere inch from Jack's face, forcing him to twist desperately out of its way. Fusilier Dodds fought at Jack's side, doing his best to protect his officer from the melee that surged around them. With a vicious snarl, he drove his weapon into the stomach of the gunner who collapsed over the blade, his fingers instinctively grabbing hold of it. Dodds pulled his bayonet back, mercilessly slicing through the Russian's grasping fingers. Stamping his right foot forward, Dodds repeatedly stabbed his weapon forward in short, efficient thrusts, the 17-inch bayonet deadly in the close quarters scrimmage. Dodds's action gave Jack the crucial few moments' respite he needed to snatch his handgun from its holster. It was a 5-shot, percussion, double-action revolver made by Deans and Adams, the best that money could buy. Jack pulled the trigger 5 times in rapid succession, a merciless close-range barrage that threw 3 Russian gunners to the ground. It was too much for the other terrified gunners. They dropped their improvised weapons and ran. Other Fusiliers who had made it over the wall raised their rifles to their shoulders and fired at the fleeing Russians. Not one made it more than a dozen yards. In their thirst for revenge, the Fusiliers kept firing, riddling the corpses of the Russian gunners where they lay. "Cease fire! Cease fire, damn it!" Jack screamed at his men to stop wasting their ammunition, using his sword to batter one man's rifle upwards so that it fired impotently into the sky. "Cease fire, damn you!" The rifle fire died out as Jack regained control of his men. The Russian gunners had been massacred. The Fusiliers had exacted their revenge. They had taken the Great Redoubt. Chapter 34. There was no joy at what they had achieved, no cheers of celebration, no shouts of victory. The Fusiliers had paid too high a price. The officers reformed their companies, the reduced ranks and missing faces a reminder of the men who had fallen. The terraced slope that ran down to the Alma River was covered with red-coated corpses. On the right flank, the 7th Fusiliers under Lacey were still engaged in a dreadful war of attrition with the 2nd Russian column, which was slowly grinding the British ranks into oblivion. The other 2 battalions, the 19th and the 23rd, were picking their way up the slope towards the redoubt. For the moment, the King's Royal Fusiliers were alone. The respite would not last long. The Russian general was sure to try to recapture the redoubt. He could ill afford to leave such a strategic strongpoint in the hands of the enemy. The remnants of Codrington's brigade would have to defend what they had won. "Sir," Digby Brown thrust a scrap of paper towards his captain. Jack was scratching the battalion's initials into the barrel of the cannon that had so nearly escaped. "What's this?" he asked. "Butcher's bill, sir. As best as I can tell, we're down to 49 effectives. We lost Sergeant Shepherd and Adams." Digby Brown's voice was tight with tension. "Thank you." "Did you see the colonel go down, sir?" "I did." "And Flowers?" "I did." Digby Brown closed his eyes to shut out the tears. With a visible effort, he composed himself, his captain's calm and measured tones helping to steady him. "Mr. Thomas is wounded, sir. He refuses to retire and go to the surgeons. Perhaps you could have a word with him?" "Perhaps he has earned the right to decide for himself." Digby Brown opened his mouth to argue, but stopped himself. His captain was right. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Mr. Digby Brown." "What for, sir?" "For agreeing with me." Jack smiled wearily. "At least it sounds like the French are still attacking." Digby Brown pointed towards the west, where banks of powder smoke rolled across the battlefield. "Don't worry about the French. Jack kneaded the small of his back. "They can look after themselves. I'm more worried about us. We appear to have been abandoned. I don't see the guards or any of those Scots bastards, do you?" Digby Brown looked anxiously towards the Alma River. The Duke of Cambridge commanded the 1st Division, which was made up of the Highland Brigade and the Guards Brigade. The two brigades should have been advancing hard on the Light Division's heels, ready to support their attack as soon as it ran out of momentum or secured its objectives. Instead, they had been halted on the far side of the Alma, where they were enduring heavy artillery fire. Oh God, they were meant to be right behind us. They were indeed, Mr. Digby Brown. Perhaps someone forgot to tell them that. Nothing would surprise me. I suggest you make the most of the peace and quiet. Tell Sergeant Baker to check weapons and ammunition and see to the wounded as best you can. I expect it will get pretty noisy around here soon." "Yes, sir." Digby Brown hurried off, glad to turn his mind to practical matters. To the south, the vast bulk of the unengaged Russian army was preparing to fight. 12 battalions of infantry were forming into more huge columns. The Russian general's conscript army knew no other way to fight. 3,000 cavalry could be seen away to the southeast. The Russian second prepared position, the lesser redoubt, lay untouched on the Russian general's far right flank, a battery of artillery in place. The Fusiliers may have seized the larger of the two earthworks, but vast numbers of the Russian force were still waiting to be committed to the battle, their men fresh and eager. Codrington's brigade was dangerously exposed. They had to hold fast until reinforcements could arrive. If the Russians recaptured the Great Redoubt, the whole bloody assault would have to be repeated, and the sacrifice the Redcoats had already made would count for nothing. "We made it, sir." Jack looked up at his orderly, unable to summon the energy to greet him with more than a thin smile. Smith had lost his shako in the assault, but otherwise appeared to have survived unscathed. Smith reached forward and prized Jack's sword from his grasp. He bent down to clean the bloody blade on the jacket of a dead Russian gunner. "Those Russians were lousy shots. Somehow they managed to miss Slater's hulking grey arse. The bastard can't be so lucky all day." "He won't have to be if I have anything to do with it. I'll worry about Slater. You concentrate on looking after yourself. You charged those bleeding Rusky gunners like a madman." "Don't worry about me. I lead a charmed life." "Fucking foolish thinking that is. Now give me your revolver. I'll bet you've forgotten to reload it." Jack meekly handed over his revolver and its pouch of ammunition and took back his hastily cleaned sword. Slater was almost as much of a threat to his survival as the Russians. It would take a miracle to survive the day. "Stand to. The bastards are coming." The handful of pickets that Codrington had thrown forward hastened to rejoin their battalions. To the southwest, a fresh Russian column was making its way across the sloping high ground towards the Great Redoubt. The column was enormous, much bigger than the one beaten back by the 19th and 23rd. The period of peace had been short, and the Fusiliers had been given little time to reorganize. The 3 battered battalions formed a single long line. The King's Royal Fusiliers were on the right, closest to the column. They would be the first to open fire. Major Peacock had emerged from wherever he had been hiding. Someone had managed to secure Colonel Morris's massive black charger, and Peacock rode forward on it to stand in front of the Fusiliers and address them. The horse fought the Major's unfamiliar control, and he had to pull sharply on the reins. Jack swore under his breath. The thought of Peacock in charge of the battalion was galling. He was spared from listening to whatever poppycock Peacock believed would stir the men to fight, because he could not hear what he said through the rattle of French and Russian musket fire to the west. Mercifully, the Major's speech did not last long. If he had expected a rousing cheer for his efforts, then he was disappointed. The Fusiliers greeted his words with stony silence, instead busying themselves with the last-minute preparations of men about to fight. They checked and rechecked their rifles and their ammunition, fidgeted with their pouches, and adjusted their uniforms. "Battalion! At 200 yards, volley fire, ready!" The Fusiliers lifted their rifles and sighted the muzzles on the enormous mass that rumbled across the slope towards them. There were enough men in the column to outnumber the brigade 3 or 4 times over, more men than had been in the whole of the light division when it had first formed up that morning. The pulsating mass of Russian conscripts cheered wildly as the drums drove them forward with their hypnotic rhythm. Boo-boom, boo-boom, boom, 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 ba-boom, ba-boom, boom, 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 ba-boom, ba-boom, boom, boom, boom. The fingers of hundreds of Fusiliers tightened on their triggers. Men drew in breath, releasing half to steady their aim, their muscles quivering with expectation. The slightest increase in pressure on the trigger, all that was needed to send the Minié bullet spinning towards the massed ranks. "Don't fire! Don't fire!" The panicked shout came from Jack's right, from somewhere towards the centre of the long line. The Fusiliers lifted their eyes from their sights and looked at each other in consternation. "Don't fire! For God's sake, don't fire! It's the French!" Major Peacock spurred his charger forward as he shrieked at the battalion, waving his hat to attract their attention. The buglers picked up the command and the call to cease fire was repeated. The huge column moved steadily closer, oblivious to the confusion in the redcoats' ranks. Jack squinted at the advancing column. Every instinct in him screamed that it could not be the French. It simply did not make any sense that a French column would be advancing towards the redoubt from that direction. As Jack stared at the column, his eyes watering with the strain, sunlight glinted off the pointed metal helmets that the approaching men were wearing. Only one army wore the spiked helmet. The column was Russian. Chapter 35. Captain Brewer raised his sword. His grenadier company had been hard hit that day. Not much more than half his men were still able to fight, but Brewer was confident the brigade still had enough fight in it to see off the Russian column. After all, they had all witnessed the way the battalion volleys had repelled the first Russian column. The bigger the column, the bigger the mess it would leave on the ground. At first, Brewer did not hear Major Peacock's panicked shouts. The noise coming from the advancing column assaulted his senses, the rhythmic pounding of the drums filling his eardrums. He only became aware that something was awry when his covering sergeant tugged urgently at his arm and pointed towards the major's frantic activity. "What the blazes?" Brewer could barely credit Peacock's flustered warning. "They're not French! The fool! Grenadiers, ignore him! Ignore him, I say! The man is deranged! Present!" Brewer's grenadiers hesitated. Peacock continued to scream at the battalion, his warning spreading uncertainty throughout the ranks. Other companies were lowering their rifles, their captains standing open-mouthed in astonishment, bewildered by the rapid change of events. "Take aim, damn your eyes! Those bastards are Russians! Take aim!" Brewer exhorted his command. Towards the centre of the battalion, puzzled Fusilier officers were stepping forwards to peer through telescopes or field glasses to confirm the identity of the soldiers. Powder smoke still billowed across the battlefield, obscuring portions of the column. Brewer looked at it again, doubt beginning to eat at him. Maybe his eyes had deceived him. But no, he was certain the column was Russian. Brewer swallowed the knot of fear that formed in his throat. If he was wrong, then he was on the point of causing a terrible catastrophe. But to let the enemy close, unchallenged, would bring about an even greater disaster. "Fire! Fire!" Brewer abandoned the usual pattern of orders, desperate to get his men firing at the enemy. He frantically pulled his revolver from its holster and fired in the general direction of the column. "Fire!" The column was far out of the revolver's range, and the single shot would not even reach the closest ranks, but it was not wasted. Its loud report secured his men's attention and confirmed his orders. "Fire, damn you!" Brewer fired his revolver a second time, and the grenadiers responded. They might as well have saved their powder for all the effect their volley had. A handful of men in the foremost rank of the ponderous column staggered and fell, but the following ranks flowed over the fallen, their pace unfaltering. It would take more than one battered company to have any impact on the immense column. "You fool, Brewer!" Peacock yanked at the reins of Morris's charger, which fought him at every turn. The horse was barely under Peacock's control as it pranced towards the Grenadier Company on the battalion's right flank. "They are the French, I tell you! The French don't fire!" Brewer glanced at his major, and for a second he saw the panic in his eyes. He looked away in disgust and screamed at his men to reload faster. Peacock was astonished at the look of contempt and fury in Brewer's expression. He pulled the charger's head back, bringing the horse to an abrupt halt, his bowels loosening with a terrible feeling of dread. He looked again at the massive column. It was close now, dangerously close, and the identity of the soldiers was obvious. Peacock could see the individual faces of the men in the first rank. He could make out details of their uniforms. Thousands of Russian infantry were bearing down on the redcoats' depleted formation. "Retreat! Retreat!" Peacock's panic was complete. His disastrous error overwhelmed what little sanity remained in his terrified mind. "Sound the retreat! Save yourselves! Retreat!" Peacock was raging, his voice shrieking in panic. The huge horse beneath him responded to its rider's terror. It reared back onto its hind feet, its huge hooves lashing furiously at the air. Peacock was thrown from the saddle and hit the ground hard. The violent impact silenced his terrified screams. But the men had already started to respond, obeying the order without hesitation. The battalion's buglers had changed their call, replacing the order to cease fire with the order to pull back. The right-hand third of the British line dissolved. The panic was infectious. Men elbowed and pushed at each other in their haste to get away. On the left, the remaining 2 battalions of Codrington's command watched in horror as the King Royal's Fusiliers ran in panic. 1/3 of the line was in full retreat. The regular battalion volleys, which should already have been flensing the compacted ranks of the Russian column, had been replaced by an uncontrolled rout. It left Codrington and the commanders of the 19th and 23rd little choice. Within moments of the first Fusiliers breaking, the rest of the brigade ordered their own bugles to sound the call to retire. The British line disintegrated, and the remnants of Codrington's brigade gave up the great redoubt which had been captured at such a terrible price. Jack watched, appalled, as the rest of the battalion broke and ran. The Russians were being allowed to recapture the vital strongpoint without a fight. Jack would not let that happen, even if it meant the light company facing the Russian column alone. "Stay where you are! Don't any bastard move!" The light company froze, heeding their captain without question. The men's faces betrayed their confusion and their fear, yet they stayed in their ranks. "Sloanes, what's happening?" Captain McCulloch ran towards the light company. His men were still in place, but they were wavering. It would take only one man to join the mad rush, and the rest of the company would be certain to follow. "Those are Russians!" Jack waved his arm frantically at the monstrous column. McCulloch understood in an instant. "Second company, form line! Form line! Stay with me!" It would take precious seconds for McCulloch to get his men back under full control. Jack knew he could not wait. "Light company!" His mouth felt terribly dry, his tongue cleaving to the roof of his mouth as he tried to shout, "Fire!" His men heard him. As one, they pulled their triggers. The heavy Minié bullets wrought a horrible destruction on the unfortunate souls who were unlucky enough to be hit, but it was no more than a pinprick on the immense body of approaching men. "Reload! Reload!" Jack screamed at his men. His voice was drowned out by a volley from McCulloch's company, sharply followed by one from Brewer's Grenadier Company. 3 battered companies were all that remained of the battalion, just over 100 men standing against thousands, a boulder in the torrent of a flooding river. Alone, they were never going to have enough firepower to stop the Russian column. They were attempting the impossible. It was brave, it was magnificent, it was also foolish. As the light company fired a second volley, the leading ranks of the Russian column raised their muskets. Only the first two ranks could bring their weapons to bear, but that still meant hundreds of muskets were aimed at the three companies of redcoats. "Dear God, for what we are about to receive." Fusilier Dodds never completed his sentence, his words drowned out by the thunderclap of the Russians' volley. Dozens of men fell to the ground, their screams of agony loud in the ears of the redcoats left standing. Their line was torn into fragments by the single volley. To stand in the face of such might was futile. To his amazement, Jack was unharmed. The musket balls had whipped past his head with a terrifying crack, but somehow his luck was still holding out. He knew he now had no choice but to retreat and save as many of his men as he could. "Fusiliers, follow me!" Jack roared at his men, pulling at those closest to him. "This way, boys! It's time to go!" Slowly, the Fusiliers understood. Jack pushed and shoved them forwards towards the security of a fold in the ground 300 yards to the northwest. The path Jack had chosen would take his men away from the rest of the British army, but at least it would get them out of the path of the Russian column, and at that moment, that was all that mattered. "McCulloch! This way!" Jack yelled at his fellow captain. The two companies were now hopelessly mixed together, cohesion forgotten in the rush to get away. Captain McCulloch elbowed his way over to Jack. McCulloch's uniform bore witness to just how close the enemy's fire had come to injuring him. One epaulet hung by a thread where a bullet had scored the shoulder of his scarlet coat, and a single round hole had been punched through the centre of his shako, smack in the middle of the battalion's brass badge. "Which way, Slomes?" Jack pointed to the shallow depression he hoped would offer the battered Fusiliers some sanctuary. "Do you see it? The fold in the ground. Take the men there. I'll bring up the rear." McCulloch nodded. "Right! Fusiliers, follow me!" McCulloch pushed through the crush of men, shouting at them to follow him and windmilling his arm to signal the direction. The men closest to him followed immediately, while Jack stayed where he was, pushing and shoving any who hesitated or dawdled. Dodds came past, a fleeting grin acknowledging his captain. With him came Dawson, Taylor and Welsh Davis, followed by the resolute form of Sergeant Baker, who still looked as crisp as if it was time for morning parade. Jack was delighted to see so many familiar faces still present. Lieutenant Digby Brown staggered past, blood trickling from a thin wound across his forehead. He was hatless, grimy, bloodied and bedraggled, but alive. There was no sign of Lieutenant Thomas or of Tommy Smith. Jack had to force his fears for their safety from his mind. His sole concern had to be for the Fusiliers who had made it. There was no sign of Brewer or of any of his grenadiers, and Jack hoped to God they had been able to get away. Of the rest of the battalion, there was no sign. The two companies had been abandoned. When the last of his men had passed him, Jack turned to make his own way to the fold in the ground. He never saw the rifle butt that smashed into the back of his head. He was unconscious before his body hit the ground. Chapter 36. Jack fought against the layers of suffocating darkness that dragged him ever deeper into their dreadful embrace, smothering his will to live. He struggled against their icy grasp, refusing to submit to their clutches, striving to reach the glimmer of light that hovered above him. Gingerly, he opened his eyes. The point of a razor-sharp bayonet glinted less than an inch above his face. "Lie still, you dirty little fucker, or I'll stick you now." Slater was on top of Jack's body, his huge frame pinning him to the ground. Jack could feel blood running down the back of his neck into the collar of his uniform coat. His vision misted over with the pain in his head. He gritted his teeth and fought to stay conscious, terrified that passing out would be the last thing he ever did. Good boy. I'm pleased you woke up. I would have hated sticking you without you knowing it. Slater's face was so close that his moustache scratched Jack's cheek. The noxious stench of his fetid breath filled Jack's nostrils. Slater eased the bayonet downwards, inching it steadily lower. Jack could smell the oil on the weapon, the sharp metal tang of the honed edge. Slater brought the blade down until its wickedly sharp point was pressed against the soft underside of Jack's chin. The bayonet pierced his skin. Jack felt Slater's muscle tense as he readied himself to slide the bayonet up through Jack's jaw and into his brain. The swing of a black regulation-issue British boot caught Slater above his left temple and knocked him sideways. The breath rushed back into Jack's lungs as Slater's huge weight left his chest, followed by a bright flash of pain as the bayonet scored the underside of his chin. "Get up, sir!" Jack's saviour leapt across his prostrate body, aiming another vicious kick at Slater's head. With reflexes that belied his size, Slater thrust his right arm upwards, taking the kick on his forearm, a hissed oath betraying the pain it inflicted. "Jack, get up!" Jack's hands had instinctively gone to his throat where Slater's bayonet had drawn blood, convinced his throat had been cut. To his relief, his probing revealed nothing more than a scratch. He was going to die. Not yet. Using his elbows as props, Jack lifted his shoulder from the ground. His vision swam and his head protested at the movement. Through his blurred sight, Jack saw Slater roll onto his knees before throwing himself forward, smacking with bone-crunching force into the body of Tommy Smith. Jack had not seen his orderly in the mad scramble for safety, yet even in the confusion and chaos of the retreat, Smith had been keeping watch over his friend. The two bodies crashed to the ground, wrapped in a violent embrace. Fists flew as the two men writhed in the dirt, punching, grabbing and scratching to get the upper hand. Smith fought hard, at least twice landing a blow on Slater's head that would have floored an ordinary man. But Slater was as strong as an ox and shook off the blows. Never before had Smith fought against such strength. He knew he could not take much more of the punishment Slater's huge fists were dishing out. He threw his weight forward, ignoring the fists that were aimed with such power, risking everything in a final reckless effort. For a second he thought the sudden lunge had caught Slater off balance, and he pushed with all his might, grasping each of Slater's forearms in a desperate bid to topple him. But Slater pushed back, returning the pressure, first matching it, then overpowering it, so that it was Smith who was forced backwards. Slater seized on the opening. He thrust Smith hard into the ground, then straddled his body, pulling one arm free from the fallen man's grasp and delivering a single massive blow to the now unprotected face. Smith's head lolled backwards, blood streaming from both nostrils. Slater followed the first vicious punch with another, then another. Smith raised his arms to shield his face, relinquishing his hold on Slater's other arm in his desperation to ward off the succession of vicious punches. With both arms free, Slater went wild, smashing down, blow after blow, coming away smothered in blood. "Stop it!" The voice sounded to Smith as if it was far away, but mercifully Slater's fists stopped their brutal assault. "Get up. Easy now, or I'll blow your damned brains out." Slater's weight eased off Smith's chest. Gingerly, Smith opened his eyes and saw the muzzle of a revolver pressed hard against Slater's temple. "You took your bleeding time?" Smith wiped the sleeve of his tunic over his bloody nose and mouth. "I thought you had the measure of him. I didn't want to spoil your fun." Jack's voice cracked with pain. He was covered in his own blood, the hair on the back of his head was matted and wet, and the dark blue collar of his jacket was black with it. "I'd have killed him if you hadn't been lying in the fucking way." Smith wearily levered himself to his feet and picked up his rifle. The pain was bad, but there was no time to dwell on it, not with Slater still breathing. Smith glanced around. The men from the light and second companies had almost all made it to the dead ground Jack had spotted. Only a few stragglers were still in sight. The great redoubt was swarming with Russian infantry, and to the south he could see more Russian gun teams heading towards the earthwork. The Russian general was reinforcing his flank, bringing fresh artillery forward. The three men were dangerously close to the enemy. Russian skirmishers were moving towards them to cover the flanks of the redoubt and clear the last ragtag groups of redcoats that were all that was left of the desperate assault on the redoubt. They would soon be in range. Slater had to be dealt with quickly. "Quick, Jack! Shoot the bastard now!" Shoot him? Jack sounded genuinely surprised at the idea. "What, do you want to dance with him? Of course shoot him, before those Russian buggers do it for you." Jack was struggling to think clearly. His mind felt as if it had been turned to porridge, so laboured and turgid was his thinking. Slater was licking his lips nervously, and his eyes kept swivelling to the side to keep sight of the revolver pressing against his temple. Jack knew Slater would not hesitate to blow his own brains out if the roles were reversed. But to kill a man in cold blood, even one as deserving of death as Slater, was something he could not make himself do. He had seen too much death already today. "Shoot him, Jack, for God's sake!" Still, Jack did not pull the trigger. The danger from the Russian skirmishers increased with every second he delayed. "Oh, you stupid bastard, I'll fucking do it!" Smith raised his rifle, pulling the heavy lock back. "No!" Jack bellowed as Smith's finger curled around the trigger of his rifle. A rifle fired, its sharp, barking cough distinctive, but the sound was too distant to have come from Smith's weapon. The crack of a bullet whipping past his head ended any confusion in Jack's mind. The first rifle to fire was swiftly followed by another, and then another. He had delayed too long. The Russian skirmishers had them in their sights. It was the second bullet fired by the Russian sharpshooters that did all the damage. It hit Tommy Smith on the left cheek, the side of his face that was angled towards the enemy skirmishers. The bullet ripped through skin and bone as if it was not there, tearing away the lower portion of Smith's face. Mouth, lips, nose and chin, all were smashed in a nauseating explosion of blood and flesh. Smith swayed but stayed on his feet. For one haunting moment, his eyes locked with Jack's, the gaze betraying the appalling shock of the terrible wound. Then he fell, his hands grasping for the lower half of his face, which was no longer there. He hit the ground and writhed in agony, still alive but unable to scream, his blood gushing from the grotesque wound. Jack ran. Bullets cracked and fizzed past him. He spared no thought for Slater or for the direction he took. He ran to escape the look of horrified anguish in his orderly's eyes. Time slowed. Jack felt as if he were wading through a lake of treacle. Bullets snapped through the air around him, but no matter how hard he tried to run, the ground moved with stubborn slowness beneath his feet. A huge fountain of earth exploded in front of him. The shockwave was tremendous. It snatched Jack from his feet as if he were a mere leaf blown in a gale. Fragments of the exploding shell ripped into his body, lacerating his arms and legs and burning like red-hot pokers. Then he hit the ground with a force that jarred every bone in his body. With the last scraps of his strength, Jack curled into a ball, his legs pulled right into his stomach, his head buried against his knees. He wrapped himself round his pain and wept. Chapter 37. "Mr. Slomes! Mr. Slomes, wake up!" Jack was dimly aware of somebody shaking his shoulder, but he ignored it. He lay curled on the ground, his eyes open, and staring, yet seeing nothing. His tears were spent, the only evidence of their passing the thin tracks they had cut into the blood and grime that covered his face. Mr. Sloames, we need you. Mr. Sloames, can you stand? Are you hurt? The questions assaulted his fragile peace, forcing him back into the awful reality of the present. What is it? Jack's voice came out as a croak, the voice of a crotchety old man disturbed from an afternoon's sleep. Thank God! I thought you were dead. Can you stand, sir? Jack's battered mind was slowly coming to life. Digby Brown? Lieutenant Digby Brown saw the matted hair on the back of his captain's head for the first time as Jack gingerly lifted it from the ground. Yes, sir. Oh, goodness me, are you badly hurt? Jack ignored the pointless question and waved his arm for assistance. Pain cascaded through his skull as he was hauled upright and dark shadows clouded his vision. Before he could fall, Digby Brown took a firm grip of his arms. Crikey, sir, you look awful. Jack was trying to take an inventory of his injuries. Every single part of his body was in pain and seemed to be leaking blood, but individually none of the wounds seemed too severe. By some miracle, his body was still in one piece. The same could not be said of his soul. His awareness was improving with every second. The blind panic and horror triggered by Tommy Smith's devastated face was receding into the depths of his mind. There it lurked, like some evil monster hidden in the shadows. For the moment it was contained, pushed to one side so that he could start to function again. Mr. Sloames? Jack pressed his hand into the base of his spine, the comforting habit of kneading his aching back instinctive. He spat out a wad of bloody phlegm and wiped a muck-encrusted hand across his face. Where's the company? Well, sir. Digby Brown looked closely at his captain. A hint of colour had returned to his cheeks and his eyes seemed focused. Digby Brown withdrew his supporting arm, but kept it outstretched in case Sloames began to sway. It's all a bit of a mess, sir. I'm not quite sure where the rest of the company went. What about Mr. McCulloch and the second company? The last I saw, they were heading back towards the 7th. Jesus Christ! Jack swore as the pressure of his hand on his spine sent a lance of pain down his legs. Digby Brown took this as the captain's verdict on the confusion and disorder. I brought as many of the men as I could find. You did? Why? Jack's knees were trembling with the effort of keeping him upright. Well, to find you, sir. To find me. It seemed like a good idea at the time, sir. I remember seeing you directing us, and then I turned round and you had disappeared. I was sure you couldn't have gone far. And the men came with you? Willingly, sir. They seemed as keen to find you as I was myself. Dear God in heaven, what a bloody mess. Quite frankly, sir, it's a fucking disaster. Jack barely noticed Digby Brown's uncharacteristic language. They had all been changed by the day's bitter events. So, what did you have in mind to do next? I rather hoped you could tell me, sir. You're right. I can. We're going over there. Jack painfully drew his sword. Digby Brown's eyes widened. His captain was pointing his sword directly at the great redoubt, which was now swarming with Russian skirmishers. The men Digby Brown had managed to lead out of the confusion gathered around Jack. He watched them closely. Dodds was there. His lean face was splattered with blood, but he had the same look of keen determination he had shown when they captured the redoubt. Next to Dodds stood Welsh Davis, Dawson, Taylor, and 15 other fusiliers from the Light Company. Sergeant Baker was the only non-commissioned officer left, and Jack nodded in his direction, acknowledging his presence. There was one face Jack did not recognise, a young fusilier with sunken cheeks and a trace of fluff on his upper lip that betrayed his boyish attempts to grow a moustache. Who the hell are you? Flanagan, sir. From 4th Company. 4th Company? What on earth are you doing here? I got lost, sir. The young Fusilier looked around him with huge eyes, nervous of being among strange soldiers, even if they did come from his own regiment. "Well, as of now you're in the Light Company. We'll need all the help we can get." Jack scanned the faces that looked towards him. The weight of the responsibility was heavy, the look of expectation in the grimy faces unnerving. But he met their stares calmly, and with determination. He would not let his men down. "We're going over there." Jack pointed his sword for a second time towards the great redoubt. The men nervously flicked their eyes at it, but not one murmur of dissent was uttered. "We're going over there because we captured that damn place, and I cannot bear to see our efforts wasted. We fought bloody hard to take it, and I'll see my soul rot in hell before I give it back to the damn Russians without a proper fight." Only Flanagan looked aghast, horrified that he seemed to have thrown his lot in with a group of lunatics. Jack fixed him with a grim smile. "You're a lucky man, young Flanagan. Now you get to fight with real soldiers." Jack saw the grins on the grimy faces of his men, just as he had intended. "Right, Light Company, extended order. Flanagan, you stay with me. Let's move." What was left of the company shook itself into a skirmish line of barely 20 men. They were going to attack. The retreat of the Fusilier Brigade towards the Alma was chaotic. The Redcoats careered down the slopes, all cohesion lost in the race for safety. The Russian skirmishers who had moved into the great redoubt poured fire into their backs, gunning down dozens and adding fresh impetus to the rout. The Redcoats had achieved so much that day. They had fought hard and won a great victory, yet left unsupported and exposed, the remnants of the 3 battalions had simply had enough, their willingness to stand and fight exhausted. As they retreated, the 1st Division finally advanced. The Guards Brigade and the Highland Brigade had endured hours under artillery fire, pinned down on the far bank of the Alma. They had chafed at their impotency, so when the order finally came to advance, they seized upon it and quickly formed up. The Highland Brigade made up the left-hand half of the 1st Division. They would march up a slope clear of debris, their route well to the east of the path taken by the Light Division's attack on the redoubt. To the right of the Highlanders marched the Guards Brigade, made up from the most famous of all the regiments in the British Army. Resplendent in their huge bearskins and with their colours flying, they looked magnificent. They were the elite of the British Army, the Queen's favourites, and they marched with an arrogant pride. They followed the path the Fusilier Brigade had taken earlier. The route was littered with the dead and the dying, but despite this, the ranks of the Guards were immaculate, the officers and sergeants ensuring the line remained perfectly in alignment. Jack was leading his men towards the right flank of one of the battalions of the Guards Brigade, the Scots Fusiliers, aiming to bring his company alongside in time to join in the Guardsmen's assault on the redoubt. His stomach churned, yet little of his earlier debilitating fears returned at the idea of a second attack on the vital position. Nothing he could yet experience could possibly be more hellish than what he had already witnessed that day. He led his men with an icy calm, his composure and his determination cleaving his soldiers to him, his firm resolution a rock onto which they could tether their souls. The men of the Light Company were moving fast, but their comrades in the Fusilier Brigade ahead of them were retreating faster. The frightened and exhausted rabble bowled towards the steady ranks of the Scots Fusiliers which stood like a breakwater across their path. "Open the files, you bloody fools!" Jack snarled through gritted teeth. From his vantage point, Jack could see what was about to happen. He pumped his legs as he led his company across the slope, expending strength he did not have in a futile effort to head off the catastrophe that was about to happen. Even as he watched, the remains of the Fusilier Brigade clattered into the line of guardsmen, a jarring collision that made Jack wince even from 100 yards away. The routing troops had one thought in their mind, to get to the rear and to safety. Not even a battalion of fresh guardsmen could stop them. The retreating redcoats drove into the ranks of Scots Fusiliers, their elbows and boots working to force a path through the line. The guardsmen' cohesion was gone in seconds. They tried to advance, but they could make no headway against the retreat. Try as they might, They were like so much flotsam caught in a raging maelstrom. One of the British Army's prime battalions had been taken out of action before it could even be brought into play. Chapter 38. Jack halted his men well short of the confusion. They sank to their knees, their chests heaving with the exertion, and watched the chaos in silence and growing dismay. Redcoats were pushing, punching and battering each other when they should have been fighting the enemy. Jack was exhausted and stood doubled over, his hands on his knees, panting like a hound following a long chase after the fox. Finally, he got enough breath into his tortured lungs to allow him to stand up. The retreating men from the Fusilier Brigade were clawing their way clear. More and more won through, while officers both on foot and mounted tried to re-establish control, their bellowed orders adding to the pandemonium. Like a rock stuck in the middle of a river in full flood, the colour party from the Scots Fusiliers stood firm. The routing redcoats were sensible enough to keep a safe distance from the fearsome halberds wielded by the sergeants who guarded the battalion's colours, defending them even from men from their own side. The colours had become a rallying point for the guardsmen, and pockets of men made their way towards the twin flags that flew with pride in the heart of the battalion. "Okay, let's go," Jack ordered his men. He had no option but to make for the one part of the Scots Fusiliers that still had some integrity. Make for the colours. The easiest route was to move up the slope before turning back to follow the last of the retreating Fusilier Brigade down the incline. Flanagan loped alongside Jack like an overgrown puppy. As they ran, Jack was forced to keep twisting his neck, trying to keep the colour party in sight, while also keeping a sharp watch on the Russians in the redoubt, lest they take it into their heads to take advantage of the confusion and push down the slope. Jack feared a Russian advance. If the Russians moved fast, they could hit the unformed guardsmen and sweep them back over the Alma with all the ease of a Tartar peasant woman cleaning the dirt from her doorstep. The survivors from the light company would be caught between the two groups, a morsel certain to be snapped up by the devouring Russian horde. "Sir, beware right!" Dodds's shout made Jack turn his head sharply. 2 battalions of the Vladimirsky Regiment had jerked into motion. Jack's fears were about to become reality. "Don't stop! Run, damn you! Run!" Jack bellowed at his men, urging them to increase the pace. They were still 50 yards short of the colour party. Jack saw with relief that the Scots Fusiliers were aware of the danger. The guardsmen were forming a line across the path of the Russian advance, their ranks reassuringly steady. But there were pitifully few of them to stand against 2 fresh Russian battalions. No more than 24 redcoats and a handful of officers and sergeants remained of the Scots Fusiliers' ordered ranks, far too few to stop the Russians. Jack's company covered the last few hard yards with their breath coming in tortured gasps. They staggered to a halt in front of a young guards captain who was waving his sword and roaring for more men to rally the colours. If he was grateful to see Jack and his ragtag company, he did not show it. "Who the devil are you?" "Sloanes," Jack stammered, his breathing still tortured. "King's Royal Fusiliers." The captain ran a professional eye over the bedraggled men and Jack's blood-stained and filthy uniform. Whatever he saw must have met with his approval. He reached out a hand and clasped Jack's shoulder in a firm grip that made him wince. "Good fellow. Have your men join the line?" Jack looked anxiously towards the redoubt. The Russian column had been halted while its officers fussily dressed the ranks, which had become disordered because of the numerous bodies that littered the ground. The Russian officers' pedantry gave the British a precious few moments to try to organise their own men and allow more redcoats to rally to the colours. Jack's men took their place in the formation, adding another 20 rifles to the line. Digby Brown and Sergeant Baker stood behind the light company, helping to dress the line, reaching down to grab ammunition or percussion caps from the many corpses that had been dragged unceremoniously out of the way. More men joined, and the line slowly extended across the slope. Jack's hopes rose. If the Russians delayed much longer, and if more men could be rallied, then there was every chance the British could hold the advance long enough for more fresh troops to be brought forward. There was still a chance to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Major Peacock staggered down the slope among the last of the retreating Fusilier brigade. His bald head was slicked with blood that flowed freely from a deep wound on his crown down into the thin rim of his hair. The fall from Colonel Morris's charger had done little to settle his terrified wits, and the Fusilier major shouted continuously as he tottered drunkenly down the slope. "Fusiliers, retire! Retire! Save yourselves!" Redcoats who had been making for the Scots Fusiliers' colours heard the new order and stopped in their tracks. In the midst of the confusion, there was no voice to countermand Peacock's orders. In the absence of any other instructions, the men did as they were told and moved away from their colours towards the river. Jack watched in horror. Men desperately needed to block the Russian advance were joining the rout and making their way to the rear. "Digby Brown, stay here." From somewhere, Jack found the strength to run back up the slope to where Peacock staggered along, his braying voice still urging the men to retreat. "Sloanes!" The single word exploded from Peacock's lips, an astonished squeak of recognition. He must have seen the rage in Jack's eyes, or perhaps the sight of his blood-splattered captain bursting through the retreating mob was too much for his scattered wits. Whatever the cause, Peacock let out a yelp of horror and turned to flee. Jack flew at the major, hitting his shoulder against Peacock's back with such force that both men were knocked off their feet. Jack's rage drove him on, the pain of the impact barely registering. He flung himself on top of the major's body, flattening him and driving the breath from his body. "Sloanes, no!" Peacock raised his hands in terror. "Please," he begged, "please don't kill me. I don't want to die, please." Jack slapped the major's hands away in disgust and stood up. It would have given him great satisfaction to beat Peacock to a bleeding pulp, but to do so was to stoop to the level of someone like Slater. Jack had embarked on his long charade to lift himself out of the gutter, to prove that whatever the chance of his birth, he was capable of so much more than society allowed. Beating Peacock would condemn him as the brutal ruffian the world expected him to be, the kind of vicious creature he so despised. Jack reached down and snapped the buckle that held Peacock's holstered revolver around his waist. He picked up the weapon and turned and walked away. He withdrew the revolver from its holster and snapped the gun open. The weapon had not been fired that day, and Jack greeted the sight of the fully loaded chambers with a grunt of satisfaction. He did not look back at Peacock lying on the ground. He thrust the revolver into his own holster, replacing the one he had lost when he fled Smith's devastating injury. He made his way back to the line of redcoats, the weight of the revolver against his hip reassuring. He risked a glance towards the Russian column. He was relieved to see they were still halted. The Russian officers were running around the flanks of the column like sheepdogs worrying around a flock of sheep. He had time to rejoin his men. The makeshift British line looked desperately feeble in the face of the two Russian columns, but Jack's mind was clear. He needed to be with his men, whatever their fate. The captain from the Scots Fusiliers saw him coming and waved him in, a wry smile on his face. "Thought you might have left us, old man." Jack grinned at the plummy voice. It would once have caused him to bite his tongue with anger. Now it did not matter. The guard's captain was willingly facing the same grim fate he himself was, his privileged birth no protection against the power of a Russian bullet. Here at least, two men from vastly different backgrounds were equals. Never, Jack smiled. I wouldn't miss this for the world. Chapter 39. The Russian infantry stirred into life, and the drummers at the centre of each column settled into the hypnotic rhythm of the march. "Here they come," Dodds announced. "Thank you, Dodds." Jack was glad of the chance to speak and break the foreboding silence that had gripped his company. "Aim low, men. Hit the bastards in the gut. Make them hurt." The officers of the westernmost Russian column, seeing what lay ahead, aligned their attack so that it would swamp the redcoats who bravely but foolishly contested its passage. The second column, further to the east, bore to the left of the redcoats' flank, ignoring their futile resistance, seeking an easier route to the Alma. It would keep them away from the fight, leaving the redcoats to concentrate their fire on the western column. Jack prowled up and down the section of the line where the remnants of the light company waited for the enemy, offering his few words of advice and encouragement. His feet scuffed against discarded equipment, the detritus of the light division's attack littering the ground. Mercifully, the bodies of the dead and wounded had been dragged to one side, so at least he was spared having to walk over their torn flesh. The captain of the guards had moved to the left flank of the line, leaving Jack to command the right. The unspoken agreement to share the command left Jack absurdly pleased with himself. There were less than 60 redcoats in the line, facing more than 10 times their number in the Russian column. In the centre of the line, the colours of the Scots Fusiliers barely stirred in the light breeze. The two colours added a touch of grandeur that seemed out of place in a scene of such appalling human devastation. "When they come, stick them with your spikes." Jack was still patrolling the line. "Make those bastards bleed." To the right, Jack saw Digby Brown draw his sword. The bright afternoon sunlight flashed from its blade. The lieutenant looked dreadfully young, flecks of dried blood standing out like engorged freckles against his pale face. He offered a tight-lipped smile when he saw his captain looking at him, his young eyes reflecting a world-weary sadness more suited to someone much older than his tender age. Jack would have liked to go to his lieutenant's side, to offer a word of comfort or to show a shred of compassion, but the advancing Russian column made that impossible. All Jack could do was return Digby Brown's brave smile with a nod of encouragement. "At 100 yards, volley fire!" The guard's captain's voice was firm, every syllable enunciated with care, as if the officer was aware these could be the last orders he was ever going to give. "Present!" The line of rifles steadied as the men braced themselves to fire. "Fire!" The volley crashed out, spitting 60 Minié balls into the packed ranks of the Russian column. Many in the front rank crumpled, as did some behind them as the powerful bullets ripped through living flesh and on into succeeding ranks. "Reload!" The guard's captain called out the orders calmly, as if conducting a company drill rather than a desperate final defence that would likely see his whole command destroyed within minutes. The men obeyed without conscious thought. To Jack's shame, he realised that he had not taken the time to find out the captain's name. He would fight this last battle under the command of a stranger. More than one redcoat fumbled his ammunition or dropped his firing caps, exhaustion and haste making his fingers clumsy. "Fire!" A second volley exploded across the slope, followed by the crackle of tardy shots from the men who had not been ready. The front of the column had been butchered. Dozens of Russian soldiers had been struck down, their bodies blocking the way of the men behind them. "Charge! Charge!" This was the time for the exhausted and bedraggled redcoats to unleash their terror on the stalled enemy. A ragged cheer erupted from their parched throats, and they surged forward, 60 men emerging from the cloud of powder smoke to charge 600 like the very hounds of hell. Jack drew his sword as he ran, the long steel edge rasping from the scabbard, its balanced weight snug in his hand. The blade felt alive, as if a vital force of energy was flowing into him, filling his aching muscles with a new strength. With his sword held high in his right hand, he tugged Peacock's revolver free from its holster with his left. The redcoats closed on the Russian ranks, their wild screams freezing the blood of the enemy conscripts. The Russian officers yelled orders, the air full of their foreign words and unintelligible commands. The column jerked into motion once more. The leading ranks hefted their own bayonets and braced themselves for the impact of the charge. Their movements were ponderous, the Russian conscripts clearly terrified of the screaming redcoats. The redcoats closed the distance quickly and hammered into the leading Russian ranks. The first Russian conscripts died in an instant, wholly unable to deflect the violent assault. The leading redcoats pulled their bayonets out of the flesh of their first victims and moved on to the next, pounding forward, stepping over their victims, stabbing and gutting without pause. Jack went with his men, his whole body thrilling to the insanity of the charge. There was a wild joy in the madness that he savoured, even as the terror and the fear cascaded through his soul. Nothing mattered, except the desire to smash his sword into the enemy, to fight and to hack at anyone who dared to stand in his way. It was irresistible. A gap appeared between Dodds and Taylor, the two redcoats fighting directly in front of Jack. He pushed into the opening, thrusting his sword forward eagerly. Its razor-sharp point pierced the flesh of a Russian soldier who had been about to stab an unsuspecting Fusilier Dodds in the side. The Russian's head whipped round with a scream as Jack's blade slid between two of his ribs. Despite the agony of the wound, the Russian twisted his hands on the musket so he could bring it round to stab his attacker. The bayonet snagged on the corner of Dodds's jacket, which gave Jack an opening. He raised his left hand and jammed the barrel of the revolver into the face of the wounded Russian. Without hesitation, Jack pulled the trigger. The Russian jerked backwards as if an invisible rope had tugged him. The bullet punched his body free of Jack's sword and sent him flailing into the soldiers behind him. Jack steadied his wrist, changed his point of aim, and fired again, repeating the action until all 5 chambers were empty. The storm of bullets struck home with appalling violence and cleared a space between him and the nearest Russians. Without a second thought, he stepped forward, relishing the opportunity to flay his sword at the enemy, heedless of the risk. As he moved, he threw the now empty revolver into the face of a Russian conscript and swung his blade wildly. To his frustration, the sword sliced into the wood of a Russian musket. Jack's arm rang with the impact, but he recovered quickly and swept the blade forward once more. This time, the tip took the throat of the Russian whose musket had blocked the first wild attack. The enemy were all around him. His mindless attack had driven him deep into the Russian ranks. Bayonets thrust at him from every angle, and it took all his speed to bring his sword round in a desperate, sweeping defence. One bayonet slipped past his blade and tore into the hem of his jacket where it stuck fast. The horrified look in its owner's eyes barely registered in Jack's mind before he swept his sword across the Russian's face, taking the man's sight in a heartbeat. Jack's men pressed forward and were soon fighting close around him once more. The redcoats had thrust hard and fast into the Russian ranks, but the column was deep and the wedge of redcoats converged into an ever finer point. At its tip, Jack and the men of the light company fought like men possessed, dozens of Russian conscripts dying under their dreadful assault. Yet redcoats, too, were falling. Steadily their numbers dwindled and the assault slowly ground to a halt against the sheer number of enemy soldiers. The Russian soldiers moved round the point of the attack, forcing the British soldiers on the flank to give ground, bending the attacking line back on itself. It was only a matter of time before the redcoats were surrounded. Chapter 40. On the far right of the attacking line, Digby Brown was desperately trying to stay alive. His left arm bled from where a bayonet had pierced the flesh to the bone, and the limb hung uselessly at his side as he fought against the horde of men pressing in on the flank. Many of the redcoats that had stood nearest to him lay dead or dying. The entire right flank was collapsing around him. Digby Brown slashed his sword to his left, beating back bayonet after bayonet. He was forced to step backwards, giving yet more ground, compressing the attacking line still further. He had no concept of what was happening elsewhere. He could not risk turning round to see if the other flank was also moving backwards. He slashed the pitted and notched edge of his sword forward, enjoying a brief surge of joy as he sliced into the neck of a Russian. It was short-lived. He recovered his blade only just in time to beat aside a bayonet that had threatened to slide into his unprotected ribcage. He took another step back as more bayonets came at him, stabbing at the spot he had just vacated. His quick feet saved him for a moment longer, the sharp points ripping his clothes but stopping short of reaching his flesh. So far he had remained silent, but finally a howl of frustration and building terror escaped through his gritted teeth as he swatted aside yet another bayonet and then another. His desire to live was so very strong. He did not want to die, not here, not now. He fought on, beating aside the enemy's bayonets with a desperate strength, his duty tying him to his position as firmly as any physical tether. The nothingness of death terrified him. The tears coursed down his cheeks as he fought. Digby Brown faced his death, but he refused to accept its approach. A Russian officer was screaming orders behind the closest conscripts, his frantic gestures summoning more men from the body of the column, bringing even more numbers to bear on the creaking flank. Digby Brown was forced to give ground again, his faltering defence barely keeping the countless thrusting bayonets at bay. The heel of his right boot caught on the body of a fusilier. It was a corpse from the Light Division's first assault on the Great Redoubt. It still lay where it had fallen, a great hole torn in the dead man's stomach, eviscerated by a Russian shell. Digby Brown was thrown off balance, and he fell onto his back across the dead fusilier, his shoulders and back lying on blood-soaked ground and spilt intestines. The bayonets were reaching for him before he even hit the ground. The blades met no resistance as the first two slipped into Digby Brown's flesh. There was no pain as the bayonets pierced his body, no searing agony as the Russians leant down on their blades, driving them into his torso so that the tips emerged through his back. But his terror bubbled through, the horror of knowing he was about to die forcing a scream from his lips. He still held his sword, and he thrust the blade upwards into the ribs of one of his assailants. The Russian let go of his rifle and grabbed Digby Brown's sword with both hands, tearing the blade from his weakening grip. It was Digby Brown's last act of defiance. Another bayonet stabbed into his thigh, immediately followed by many more, the sharp blades rammed home with enthusiasm. The pain came now, a terrible wave of agony that flared and built until mercifully he lost consciousness. Digby Brown died, unaware of the last terrible ravages wrought on his body. The Russian conscripts vented their fear in a frenzy of stabbing and hacking, the young officer's body torn to bloody shreds in their rage. Jack fought with wild abandon. He had no idea what was happening around him. He saw nothing but the next blow, sought nothing but more victims for his blade, its edge now blunted by countless blows that had landed against muskets or bayonets that blocked it from finding its way into Russian flesh. The men at his side fought with ruthless efficiency and a merciless professionalism that had the Russian conscripts backing away rather than face them. Jack and his men walked on the bodies of their victims, occasionally ramming their weapons down into the ruined flesh beneath their boots, quenching any last resistance from the men they had struck down. They were surrounded by the dead and the dying, the stench of blood and open bowels thick in their throats. The very depths of hell were exposed on the Russian plain. Their arms were leaden, their muscles protested at every movement, yet they fought on, their rage sustaining their bodies far beyond the point of exhaustion. Jack sobbed as he fought, the pain in his battered body an unrelenting agony. Fusilier Dodds still fought at his side, uttering an unceasing stream of obscenities as he killed the men who stood against him, his curses the last sound they would ever hear. Less than half the redcoats who had formed the makeshift line still lived. The Scots Fusilier captain who had brought them together was dead, his body surrounded by the corpses of the men he had slain. The 2 lieutenants who carried the colours still lived, protected by the colour sergeants who ferociously beat off any Russian who sought fame and fortune by capturing their enemy's pride. The surviving redcoats were being pressed ever closer together. The flanks had long since folded, and the British were reduced to a desperate huddle, surrounded and alone. The pressure on the small knot of men was unceasing. Wave after wave of Russian soldiers rushed forwards, urged on by their officers or dragged into the fight by a sergeant. Jack blocked another bayonet that was thrust at his stomach, punching the hilt of his sword into the attacking Russian's face, bludgeoning the conscript to the ground. A Russian sergeant immediately moved to take the man's place. He thrust his bayonet forward with rapid professional jabs that took all of Jack's wavering strength to counter and left him no opening to counterattack. Jack blocked and blocked, each blow jarring his agonized muscles. The Russian sergeant sensed his superiority and pressed forward relentlessly. Then, everything changed. The deafening bark of a battalion volley crashed out to the right of the Russian column. Jack heard crisp British voices immediately issuing orders to reload, their clipped tones more suited to the parade ground than this sordid butcher's yard of a battle. Russian soldiers on the right of the column fell to the ground, scythed down like stalks of wheat cut by a threshing machine. The dense Russian formation shuddered, and then emitted a dreadful groan, like an enormous wild animal fatally wounded by a hunter's well-aimed shot. The shudder became a spasm as the Russian conscripts were thrown into confusion. A second British volley shattered any vestiges of cohesion as the shocked conscripts clawed at each other in their sudden haste to escape. The pressure on the small knot of redcoats eased instantly. The Russian sergeant facing Jack rammed his bayonet forward with one last half-hearted thrust that Jack easily knocked aside. The 2 men stared at each other, each astonished at the sudden change in circumstances. Neither moved to attack. For a moment there was an unexpected bond between them, a fleeting notion of comradeship. The Russian looked at Jack, then shrugged his shoulders, turned, and made his escape. The exhausted redcoats looked at each other in confusion, unable to comprehend the sudden change in fortune. Out of the smoke of their volley, they saw the tightly formed ranks of the Coldstream Guards. Triumphant, their ordered formation belonged to a different world, a place the battered and bloody redcoats had forgotten. With a series of crisp commands, the Coldstream reloaded their rifles and sent another volley into the fleeing Russian column, mercilessly driving home their attack. A ragged cheer emerged from the parched throats of the handful of redcoats who had fought an entire Russian column to a standstill, and who now stood in disbelief as the enemy that had come so close to destroying them fled in chaos and disorder. With gritty eyes, Jack watched the Coldstream Guards advance up the slope towards the great redoubt. He had never known such exhaustion. His body trembled, every muscle ached. He sank to his knees, his bloody sword still held fast in his hand, his fingers unable to release their grip after holding the sharkskin-covered handle for so long. Not many of his men were left. Dodds stood faithfully at his side, silently picking at the blood that was crusted under his fingernails, his eyes dull and devoid of life. Sergeant Baker stared into the distance, his face covered in blood from a vicious wound on his scalp, his uniform hanging in ribbons from where countless Russian blades had scored through the thick fabric. Young Fusilier Flanagan was alive. The stray from 4th Company was bent at the waist, vomiting a thin trickle of green bile onto his boots, his shako still firmly planted on his head. Dawson, Taylor, and 6 other Fusiliers from the Light Company sat silently, the whites of their eyes bright against their filthy faces. A handful of survivors, all that remained of Jack's company. The battle continued as the Coldstream Guards assaulted the great redoubt. The Highland Brigade started its attack, the fresh troops advancing on the Russian right. Against all odds, Raglan could savour a victory when so easily he might have had to suck on the sourness of defeat. But for the exhausted remnants of the Light Company, the battle was over. They had done their duty. Their stubbornness and defiance had held the Russians long enough for fresh troops to be brought up. Their efforts had not been in vain. With a groan, Jack used the point of his sword to lever himself to his feet. "Sergeant Baker." Jack's voice cracked, his parched throat making speech difficult. Despite his wounds, Baker clicked his boots together and stood to attention. "Sir." "Look after the men. All of them." Jack waved a weary arm around him, encompassing the dead as well as the living. "Yes, sir." "Stay here. Don't let anyone drag you back into the fight. You've done enough. More than enough." Jack said nothing else as he left his company for the last time. Ignoring his tortured body, he abandoned his men to Sergeant Baker's care and set off back across the slope. He had one last duty to perform. Chapter 41. Jack traipsed his way towards the fold in the ground where he'd hoped to hide the Light Company when Peacock's terrible error caused the Fusiliers to break. His abused body laboured to keep moving, and it took all of his dwindling willpower to force it to struggle onwards. The ground was strewn with the detritus of battle. His feet stumbled against discarded equipment. The bodies of the dead were everywhere. Jack had to force himself to ignore the mangled flesh, each twisted body a tragedy in its own right. The accumulation of death on such an unimaginable scale enough to soil a soul for all eternity. The wounded pleaded for his aid. Voices racked with pain begged for help, for water, for their mothers, or simply for a bullet to end their suffering. Jack walked carefully past their ruined bodies, careful not to jar his heavy boots against their tortured flesh, deaf to the pitiful pleas that accosted him, his stony expression betraying none of the sorrow that the sight of such suffering caused him. As he walked, he thought of his men, the ones still living and the ones who had fallen. He thought of Colonel Morris, of Lieutenant Flowers, and of Digby Brown. Finally he came to the place where the Russian shell had lifted him off his feet. His memory was hazy, yet still vivid enough for him to recognize the terrain. He saw the scorched marks on the churned earth where the shell had exploded. He fancied he could even discern the crushed grass that revealed where he had curled on the ground, when the horror had overwhelmed his mind and temporarily displaced his sanity. With a heavy tread, Jack turned to plod wearily up the shallow incline of the slope, retracing the path along which he had run in such terror. Around him the sounds of battle still raged, yet to his exhausted senses the cacophony of battle sounded muted, as if it was taking place in the far distance instead of only a few 100 yards away. His senses were dulled to such an extent that he felt almost at peace. His battered mind found nothing remarkable in the occasional Russian artillery shells that exploded nearby, or attached any consequence to the round shot that punched through the air within yards of where he walked. The sight of the torso he was looking for made Jack straighten his shoulders. His weariness fell away. He had no difficulty recognizing the familiar figure of his orderly. He looked down on what remained of Tommy Smith's face. His stomach churned, yet he managed to keep the wave of nausea under control. Tommy Smith was dead. His sightless eyes stared up at the clear blue sky. It was what Jack had trudged all this way to discover. The idea that his orderly might still be alive with such a terrible wound was more than Jack could bear. "He's a dead 'un." Jack was not surprised to hear that voice again. Part of him had known that coming to find Tommy Smith would result in having to face Slater one last time. "And I reckon you should join him, don't you?" Jack stayed still, his gaze fixed on Smith's staring blue eyes. "You were a fool not to drill me when you had the chance. But then, you always was a soft little turd." Slater paused to spit out a wad of phlegm. "I reckon you even started to believe you actually was an officer." From deep inside, Jack summoned the energy to turn round and face Slater. The former colour sergeant was standing a few paces away. The revolver he was aiming at Jack looked like a child's toy in his meaty hand. "You're a fool, Lark. You were born a fool, and you'll damn well die a fool." The unfamiliar revolver was clumsy in Slater's hands as he cocked the weapon and curled his finger round the trigger. Jack recognised the gun as his own, the barrel pointed straight at his heart. He looked up and stared into the pit of hatred in Slater's merciless eyes and saw death. Jack threw his body forward, diving onto the ground. He moved like an old man, his abused body as supple as a brick. He was slow, so very slow. The cough of the revolver blasted into Jack's ears a fraction of a second after the bullet punched into his body. The impact of the single bullet twisted his diving body, throwing him backward so that he landed awkwardly on his side. Pain surged through him, an agony so fierce that his vision faded. He heard the revolver firing again and again as Slater wildly emptied all 5 chambers. Jack's body tensed, waiting for a second explosion of agony. The air around him was punched with violent force as the bullets flew past, but Slater's wild firing and lack of familiarity with the gun had sent the bullets wide. Slater stood with the smoking revolver cradled in his hands, staring at Jack's twitching body. The fresh blood on the grass confirmed that his aim had been true. His enemy's desperate dive had not saved him from the fate he so richly deserved. Jack's body gave a final jerk, and then lay still. It was over. Slater savoured the sweet taste of revenge. Jack felt the cold fingers of death slide over his heart. He sensed the nothingness of oblivion pulling at him, an awful void from which there was no return. Something deep inside him flickered. A final spark of life that rebelled against his fate. Jack Lark would not go so meekly to his death. He opened his eyes. He saw Slater standing over his prostrate body, gloating. The sight filled Jack with rage, a righteous fury that fueled his injured body. He snapped his legs straight, driving the heels of his boots against Slater's knees. The sickening crunch of bones breaking was clearly audible. Slater crumpled over his shattered kneecaps, the suddenness of Jack's violent attack taking him completely unaware. He hit the ground hard, his 2 hands reaching down to his mutilated knees, his screams drowning out the sounds of battle that still ripped and crackled through the air. Jack stumbled to his feet, moving away from Slater, his left hand pressed over the wound on the right side of his body. His blood pulsed through his tightly clenched fingers. He saw Slater twist on the ground, heard his sobs as the huge man scrambled towards Smith's rifle, which lay discarded on the ground. Jack reached the rifle just before Slater's meaty paws wrapped round the stock. He snatched it away and ruthlessly crushed the grasping fingers under his boot. Slater bellowed. He reached for Jack's ankle, fighting on. Jack felt the thick fingers claw at his flesh. Without hesitation, he brought the rifle round until the long barrel pressed hard against Slater's temple. For a fleeting instant he thought of Molly. He smiled as he pictured her blowing away the errant curls of hair from her face, the knowing smile on her face as she saw him watching her. The memory fled, leaving just the twisted face of the man who had killed her. Jack was certain he saw the flare of fear deep in Slater's eyes, the realization that he was about to die triggering a spasm of horror. Jack felt nothing as he pulled the trigger. The bullet punched through Slater's skull, killing him instantly in a grotesque shower of blood, brain, and bone. As Jack looked down at Slater's body, a violent storm of emotion shuddered through his pain-racked body. It scoured his soul and released the passions that he had kept contained for so long. He screamed at the heavens, a single incoherent shriek of bitter grief. In the sudden silence that followed, Jack's head sagged forward, all emotion spent, his soul an empty husk. He staggered back to Smith's corpse. He ignored the wounds to his own body, was hardly aware of the flow of blood that pulsed out of his side with every beat of his racing heart. He did not care about the future. The past did not concern him. His charade was over. With the final vestiges of his strength, Jack bent low and started to strip the uniform from Tommy Smith's corpse. He sobbed as he dragged off the heavy red coat that was stiff with dried blood. His fingers felt the cheap cloth of Smith's jacket. The heavy weave was so different from the beautiful scarlet fabric that he had stolen. He had lived up to his desire to better himself. He had proved that he could lead men in the tumult of battle. He had not let Molly down. It was time for Captain Slomes to die. Epilogue. The stench was overpowering. It assaulted Jack's senses, demanding his attention. Its nauseating stink flooded his nostrils, filling his mouth with its foul odour so that he came back to the world of the living, retching and coughing. "Oi, oi, someone's coming back to us." Rough hands lifted his head and pressed the cold rim of a tin mug against his lips. The noxious smell of the liquid that was tipped over his sore and swollen lips made him gag, but the hand that held him was unyielding, so he could do nothing but swallow the bitter drink. "There you go, chum. It ain't as good as rum, but it's all you're going to get for the moment." Despite its foul stink, the water at least unglued Jack's mouth and moistened his throat enough for him to question his benefactor. "Where am I?" There was a gentle chuckle. "Where are you?" The voice found the question amusing. "Well, chum, you're in hospital. In the shithole they call Scutari. You've been raving with the fever the last few days, hollering at the sky. Now, rest easy. None of us is going anywhere, not unless we carks it, that is. And that ain't something we can do a fucking thing about, so take it as it comes." Jack did as he was told and closed his eyes, hoping for the sanctuary of unconsciousness. All soldiers feared the surgeons, feared being incarcerated in the army hospitals where death was as likely an outcome as life. Jack was in the place all soldiers dreaded, and it terrified him. His lips formed the words of a silent prayer, one he had learned as a child. It had crept into his mind unbidden, eerily apt. "If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Scutari had become infamous in the army even before the battle. It was where the sick were taken to die. Now, after the battle, and overwhelmed by hundreds of injured soldiers, it was rapidly descending into a scene of biblical squalor. Men lay everywhere, their bodies still encrusted in the filth of the battlefield. Nearly 2,000 souls had been brought to the hospital, which had beds for barely half that number. The handfuls of orderlies, doctors and surgeons worked tirelessly, but they were hopelessly outnumbered by the multitude of broken bodies that begged for their attention. The beds in which the lucky few were laid were filthy, the floor around them encrusted with ordure. The handful of slop buckets in each dank room overflowed with human waste. The wounded soldiers did not have the comfort of even a single blanket to cover them. Their bodies were devoured by lice. They were unwashed and stinking, and they still wore the soiled and reeking rags they had arrived in. The few windows in the rooms were bolted shut, condemning the wounded to lie in the gloom, denied the joy of sunlight or of the breeze that would have eased the stifling, stinking, suffocating heat that tormented their final hours. The injured soldiers stared at the high-vaulted ceilings and suffered. Their torture had started on the battlefield where they had been left, in some cases for 24 long hours before they were carried onto the beach for evacuation. From there, if they were still alive, they were taken by ship to the hospital at Scutari, 300 miles away. It sat like a festering sore on the coast of Turkey, opposite the splendour and the vibrancy of Constantinople. The ships struggled to transport the vast number of wounded, who shared the limited space with hundreds of men who had been struck down with fever before the battle had even been joined. The decks were blanketed with the bodies of the sick and wounded. Men died in the filth, uncared for and alone. Their bodies were dumped unceremoniously overboard or simply left to rot where they lay. Most ships had just one or two orderlies, or perhaps a single surgeon to cope with the hundreds of men. The dreadful journey lasted 3 to 5 days, each an interminable hell, where minutes crept by like hours and hours felt like days. One ship, the Shooting Star, took a dreadful 13 days to make the trip to Scutari, a period of unimaginable horror for the 130 wounded on board. Just under half died in the time it took their vessel to reach its destination. The hospital at Scutari was a dubious sanctuary for the men whose bodies had been broken in the horror of the fighting. If shock, infection, gangrene or loss of blood did not kill them, then a raft of fatal diseases claimed them. Typhus, dysentery, cholera, fevers. Disease stalked the hospital, thriving in the dank and squalid conditions. Jack gave up counting the bricks in the vaulted ceiling above his head. He had drifted in and out of consciousness for what could have been minutes or hours or days. Time had no meaning. He remembered little of his journey to the hospital save for mere flashes, random memories of being taken to the shore on one of the pitifully few carts the army had available to transport its wounded. Of the short voyage itself, he remembered nothing. He could hazily recollect the pain of his flesh being stitched back together and the feeling of deft hands binding his wounds, but whether they had been on board the ship or in the hospital, he had no idea. The memories of battle he locked away in a far corner of his mind and threw away the key. But his dreams betrayed him. They broke down his barriers, replaying the horror so he woke in terror, bathed in sweat, his body trembling with fear. The wounds to his soul ran deep. He tried to remember the past, but memories of his childhood or of his early years in the army resisted all his attempts to access them. Even Molly's face remained stubbornly distant. The image of her he carried in his mind was faded, robbed of its vitality, little more than a vague impression. He lay on his filthy bed and tried to shut out the constant moans, groans, sobs, curses and pleas of the other inmates. Mercifully, the men on either side of him were silent, although they were pressed so close together that Jack's bed vibrated with every movement made by the wounded guardsmen in the beds to his right. Barely 2 inches separated the rows of filthy beds. A narrow gap down the centre of the room gave access to any of the scarce medical staff who dared to venture into the fetid space. Once Jack had woken to the sound of a fresh patient being brought in. He had watched with morbid fascination as 2 orderlies deftly settled the man into the bed, and then bound his wounds with bandages stained with old blood. It did not take long. Their practised hands worked swiftly. Neither orderly said a word during the few minutes they were in the room. Jack knew he faced a choice. He could give in to his despair and let the grief and the guilt and the festering horror claim him, body and soul, or he could once again fend for himself. He could rise from this stinking pit and find a way to live. "Oi, what's your game?" Jack started, his battered nerves jangling at the sudden shout. He had been scraping a metal ladle across the bottom of a wooden bucket that should have held enough fresh water for the whole room, but which now yielded only a few thimblefuls of dark brown, scabby liquid. The desire to bark back at the overweight orderly corporal was hard to subdue. His mind was responding as if he were still a captain who could command immediate respect. The corporal's florid face twitched with annoyance. He stood staring at Jack, wiping his bloody hands across an apron that was so encrusted with blood and filth that it stood proud of his body, as stiff as thick card. "Just getting some water, Corporal." "Well, if you're recovered enough to be out of bed, you're well enough to be past fit. What's your name?" "Smith, Corporal." "Smith? There's more bleeding Smiths in this here hospital than there are lice in my crotch. You taking me for a ride, Sonny Jim?" "No, Corporal. My name is Smith, Tommy Smith." "Well then, Tommy Smith, seeing as you is hale and hearty enough to be up and strolling around, you can give me a hand." Jack straightened up, wincing as the wound in his side pulled painfully. The corporal sneered at him. "It's no good acting like you is hurting now. I've got your number. Come over here and grab this deaden by his ankles." Jack did as he was bid, looking dubiously at the body of the man who had laid so silently in the bed immediately next to his own. "Is he dead, then?" "Well, he ain't bleeding dancing, is he, poor sod? Is he dead indeed? Of course he's bleeding dead on account of the fact that he ain't been bleeding breathing for the last 2 bleeding days. Now, grab hold and shut up." "Yes, Corporal." The 2 men lifted the dead weight of the redcoat from the stinking bed. Jack was forced to tug at the man's legs, which were stuck to the filthy sheet. The smell of the dead man was awful. "Come on, let's take this poor sod away. Then I reckon there's more work for you to do, young Tommy Smith, if you don't fancy being past fit for duty, that is." Jack staggered as he helped carry the dead redcoat from the room, his legs betraying his weakness. There was a sharp tut of disapproval from the corporal. It was a struggle, but between them they carried the body outside to a walled yard that was already piled high with corpses. "Bloody hell!" Jack could not keep back his exclamation of horror. The dead had been dumped without ceremony, and lay in all manner of unnatural positions, legs and arms bent at impossible angles. Some lay with their eyes wide open, staring serenely at the clear blue sky, while the faces of others were twisted and terrible, their tongues bulging grotesquely from gaping mouths. The wounds that had killed them were evident on most of them, their bodies missing one or more limbs, or with large holes in what had once been living flesh. It was a scene straight from a nightmare. Jack dropped the legs of the fresh corpse he carried and bent double, vomiting out his horror at the dreadful sight. "Come on, lad. That's enough of that. These poor sods don't care. Not any more." The corporal let go of his end of the body and reached forward to place an unexpectedly soothing hand on Jack's back, rubbing it in small circles like a parent winding a child. Jack wiped the saliva that dangled from his mouth on his soiled cuffs and straightened up. The corporal was right. The dead were past caring. "Good lad." The corporal turned to lead Jack from the charnel house. "Plenty more to shift," he said over his shoulder. "Officers too. Not that the jack puddings get dumped outside. Oh, no, we have a special room for the toffs." The corporal led Jack through a confusing maze of gloomy corridors. "Here we are. One officer recently expired." Jack followed the corporal's corpulent figure into a dark side room that contained a single bed. The body of a young man lay peacefully in it, a sheet neatly tucked around it. Somebody had taken the time to undress the unfortunate officer. His uniform lay folded on top of a travelling chest that had been placed to one side of the bed so that it could double as a bedside table. "He's dead." "What is it with you? Yes, he's a dead and all right." "What killed him? He looks like he's just asleep." "Fever. He's been here nigh on a fortnight, from before the battle. I was only speaking to him yesterday. He seemed as right as rain, telling me all about his new commission and everything." "What do you mean?" "Well," the corporal perched his oversized backside on the corner of the bed, relishing the opportunity to talk. "His ma and pa died a little while back, and he just got his inheritance, you see. Now, a clever chap like you and me would spend that wisely on beer or women or something worthwhile like that. But this young fool blows the whole bleeding lot on a captaincy. And not just that, but a captaincy in a regiment stationed in bleeding India, of all places. He was going to make his fortune, or so he thought, the daft bugger. Why anyone would want to go to that heathen place is beyond me. Like, it's beyond him now, poor sod." Jack looked down at the ill-fated officer who had died just as he had secured the same rank that Jack himself had risked so much to take as his own. "What was his name?" "His name? Oh, let me think. Danbury, I think. Yeah, it was, that's it. Lieutenant Danbury, or Captain Danbury, I suppose now." Jack smiled. "Danbury. That's a good, honest name. I like it."
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.